David Foster Wallace once famously told the story about how two young fish are swimming along merrily when an older fish passes them. The older fish, as it passes, asks, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" The two young fish keep swimming for a while, and then one of them turns and asks the other, "What the hell is water?" The point of Wallace's story was to point out that, in his words, quote, "the most obvious important realities are often the ones that are hardest to see and talk about," stop quote. And I want to talk today about something that is all around us in India, and unlike water for the fish, actually makes our lives harder in countless ways. And yet, it is normalized and we don't talk about it at all. I'm talking about the Indian state. Our state is dysfunctional and fails us in a million ways. It doesn't do the things it is supposed to do. It gets in our way when we try to make our lives better. It has hobbled India's progress, and its failure has a humanitarian cost. And yet, we ignore all this and keep turning to the state for solutions. I have long said, in fact, that India's biggest religion is not Hinduism, but the religion of government. No matter what problem we are faced with, we turn to our Mai Baap Sarkar for solutions, even when the Mai Baap Sarkar caused the problem in the first place.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen, our weekly podcast on economics, politics, and behavioral science. Please welcome your host, Amit Verma.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen. My guest today is Subhashish Bhadra, author of a brilliant new book called Caged Tiger, How Too Much Government is Holding Indians Back. This is a book that needed to be written, and I'd classify it as an essential book to read if you want to understand India today. I loved reading the book. I loved the talk I attended where Subhashish spoke about this book, and I thought this episode would be mainly about the subject of the book. But when we recorded, I found Subhashish to be reflective and wise, and the first hour and a half was an intimate conversation about his life that made me reflect on my own. I loved all of this conversation, the personal, the political, the philosophical, and I think you will as well. But before we get to it, let's take a quick commercial break.
For most mothers, there are so many silences that deserve to be held together and vocalized in safe spaces free of judgment. I'm Priya, a stay-at-home mum of two. One day, I decided to call two of my most amazing friends who also happen to be psychologists and moms, and we decided to chat about just the stuff that goes into being a mom.
My name is Gunjan. I am a clinical psychologist by profession and a mum of twins. It is my deep passion to change conversations around parenting, about parenting, within parents.
My name is Bakul, clinical psychologist and therapist, and I'm also a mum. So what is being a mother like? I think these are discourses of the complexity of and richness of being a mum that also needs to occupy space to visualize the being of motherhood.
The Mommy Mixtape is a podcast that attempts to start conversations around motherhood and maternal mental health. Listen in on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Perspectives from mums who are winging it and winning.
Subhashish, welcome to The Seen and the Unseen.
Thank you, Amit.
So, I'm so delighted that you've written this wonderful book, Caged Tiger. And as I was telling you over lunch, and I'll tell my listeners again now, circa 2007, 8, 9, around that time, I wanted to write a book about how India only has political freedom, not social and economic freedoms. And I even thought of a name for the book, like this is a classic book by LaPierre and Collins called Freedom at Midnight. So I thought I'll call my book Freedom After Midnight and talk about how we don't have freedoms after midnight. All we got in 1947 was political freedom and not the other kinds, and then lay out a litany of complaints. I even sent a proposal to the New India Foundation. Ram turned me down with a very polite letter. and that was one of like 50 projects I never got down to doing. And I'm so glad that you've written your book, because now that guilt is off me. I don't have to write that anymore. So thanks a lot for that.
You possibly should write that book anyway, given that there's so much more to be said on these issues. I don't think one book does justice to that.
That's true, but as we were discussing over lunch, it's kind of incredible how there aren't enough books on it. There are barely any books on it, or barely anything kind of documenting this period and so on. But before we start talking about the book, which I do want to dive into in detail, I'm just interested in knowing more about you. So, tell me a bit about your childhood, where did you grow up? What was that like?
Sure, happy to do that. So my childhood is an armed forces childhood. So my father was in the Navy, and for some strange reason, we were able to manage being in Delhi for all of that period, most of that period. So I grew up fairly living kind of the armed forces life, going to doing the things that armed forces kids do, and unfortunately or fortunately, with a lot of focus on just academics. So I come from that kind of a family where the way you were perceived within the family was really determined by the kind of academic scores you had. In fact, I remember my grandfather when he was on the verge of his last few years, and when I last went to meet him, he forgot my name, but he remembered my high school grades. He's like, "You're the kid who got that much, right?" I'm like, "Yeah." So that was my background, which was a lot of just the usual things that people who call themselves the Indian middle class do, which is focusing on academics, extracurriculars, and all of that. Was fortunate to be able to go to St. Stephen's in Delhi, study economics. At the end of those 3 years, said, I can't do this anymore. I can't study anymore. So I decided to work in McKinsey and Company, where I worked on projects ranging from pharma to steel, etc. After which I went to Oxford on the Rhodes Scholarship, studied economics there. And I think for me, that was the life-changing experience, because at the time I went there, the Rhodes Must Fall movement was at its peak. A lot of my peers in the Rhodes Scholar community were involved in all of that. So that, I think, was the transition for me personally, from being someone who really was on that treadmill, thinking about academics, thinking about getting ahead in life, to thinking about social justice, thinking about things that you don't think about, looking at these peers that I had from other parts of the world who'd maybe studied physics but were now suddenly studying history of the Middle East, and saying that, okay, you can kind of open your brain in this way. But at the end of those 2 years, I said, look, India's at a great inflection point. I need to come back and participate in this. And so that's when I came back. I started working at Omidyar Network, which is a global philanthropic organization, helped them set up their vertical on digital identity, data privacy, and these kind of issues. One thing led to the another, then leading kind of to this book, which we'll talk more about. So if I have to kind of summarize all of that, I'm basically someone who spent almost his entire life in the corporate world. I belong to that world. That's where I've spent 8 or 9 years of my life, but someone who on the side has had a lot of interest in the bigger questions of nation building, which then kind of led to this book.
So, I'm going to double click on separate parts of that and kind of dive in deeper. And I want to double click into your childhood, and I'm struck by the word you used right at the end, where you stressed on belong, where you said you belong to the corporate world, and we'll talk about your corporate experiences later. But I'm curious about that childhood when you're living the army life, you're going from place to place and you're meeting different people. And, an earlier guest on my show, Chuck Gopalakrishnan, once told me that when he was in school, he really wanted to belong so badly, and he realized, and this was in college actually, and he realized that for him the way to belong was to be the funny guy, to be the guy with the wisecracks and the jokes and all of that. And I realized that people can find different ways of belonging, even when you might feel you don't belong, but maybe you get good in a sport and okay, you've got some kind of tribe happening there, or you get really good in studies and you're in the front bencher a bunch, as it were. And I'm not sure how much self-reflection any kid does, but like today when you look back, when you think about sort of that shaping of yourself, what was that process like? Because I would imagine that process comes with two simultaneous anxieties. And one is that anxiety of fitting in. You want to fit in, you want to be popular. In the context of your family, the way to get that validation was by academics and etc., whatever other behavior might have been associated with that. But at the same time, you also got to find yourself. You also got to figure out who you are, what you want in life, which is never easy, which sometimes can take a lifetime. So what were these two for you? Just
very deep question, and certainly things that I have thought about, and specifically the word belonging, as you rightly said. And for me, I always articulated it as this notion of home. And what is home? Is it a place? Is it a set of people? Is it values? I still don't have the answer to that. And for me, one of those moments when this really hit me home was the place where we used to live in Delhi had a 5-star hotel right in front of it. And for 7-8 years, we never had the wealth to be able to afford that 5-star hotel. We could never enter there. In fact, once when I tried to enter, we were blocked by the guard saying that, hey, you obviously don't look like people who can afford this place. And then when I started working at McKinsey, one of the first things they did was we were going kind of for a company offsite, and funnily happened to live in that hotel. So they put us up there, and I was actually up all night, not doing anything, but just thinking maybe I've made it in life. But then I kept going back to that hotel because then I realized, you know what? Now I can't go back to that place I used to call home because it's a defense colony. So now that I'm out of the defense, my father's retired, etc., I can't go back there. So for me, therefore, this notion of belonging, I've really struggled with it. Places I grew up in Chanakyapuri in Delhi are places which are obviously not open to people who are not from who's are not from the defense background. So I can't go back there. For the longest time, I was a management consultant, used to travel a lot. I used to say my home is my suitcase, right? Wherever my suitcase sits is home for me. But I have over time at least come to realize that I think belonging for me is a set of people and a set of values, and where I can find those that resonates with me and that feels like I can start putting down roots there. So right now I live in Bangalore, and I've spent about 7 years there, and I have kind of built an entire life there. So for me, that has now become an aspect of belonging. But I do believe that for especially people whose kind of parents have grown up with transferable jobs, etc., that notion of home and belonging, etc., can be fairly complex.
And it cuts both ways. I mean, on the one hand, there is, of course, a romance of, I think it was a Marvin Gaye song, Wherever I Lay My Head, That's My Home, the constant itinerant traveler, as it were. And like, I've actually asked this question to many of my guests, what is a notion of home? And I remember Max Rodenbeck, who used to be the editor of The Economist here, he grew up in Cairo. So he said, my home is Cairo, but it's not the Cairo of today. It's a Cairo of when I grew up, right? So it is really a place in memory, in a sense. And I feel conflicted about this, that on the one hand, I can't identify home. I can't answer that question. Sugata Srinivasa Raju uses beautiful phrase on my podcast, rooted cosmopolitanism.
Yeah.
And I have the cosmopolitanism, but I'm afraid I lost the rootedness, and that's a lament, right? And I think it can cut both ways, that in one sense, it can be liberating, that you can go anywhere and you can find people like yourself and you can make a comfort zone. But on the other hand, for a lot of people, it can take away so many of the anxieties of where you are in life and where you belong if you just kind of have that, that rootedness, a place where you are, even if it, imprisons you in grooves that were not necessarily of your making.
And I think therefore finding that anchor in life becomes really important. I've seen a lot of my peers find that anchor in professional fulfillment. So they kind of go for it, right? And they're working really hard, and whatever it be, either recognition or money, whatever gives them that anchor. For me, that anchor becomes people around me. It becomes, for example, in my current life, becomes my dog, right? You keep something that keeps you anchored in that moment, anchored in what you want to do. So I think now my thought in life has shifted from roots and home to anchors, and putting down these big and small anchors everywhere, that on a day you're not feeling at your best, still you can go back and say, okay, this is my temporary home.
There's a lovely Instagram post where you're playing with some dogs, and I think the caption is something like, never happier than when I'm with dogs. And I wanted to ask you about these anchors. I mean, I didn't have the word then, but just like, what is your comfort zone? Like, who is the you outside of the work you do in the corporate world, or the work you do, in writing a book or whatever? What is that comfort zone? Describe that for me.
So for me, that comfort zone is the pursuit of happiness. What I mean by that is, for example, I have an image in my head that my ideal life is where, for example, I'm lying on the couch reading a book, sipping like a warm beverage with my dog, etc. The pursuit of that idea is honestly what gives me that anchor in life. Again, just to be clear, that this whole my affinity for dogs also comes from a place of trauma. As while I was growing up, I had a dog, and we kind of moved cities, and the dog fell really sick. We were moving back to Delhi. We couldn't take her with us. And of all things I've experienced in life, that's my most traumatic moment, was the moment of having to give up that dog. So the ability right now to fulfill that childhood dream of having a dog and taking care of it is what really drives me. So every day, even after a hard day at work, or if things haven't gone right, etc., to come back and be with that dog is great for me. And as you rightly said, right, these are the kind of the smaller things of life. Yesterday, when I checked into my Airbnb here, it had an aqua guard, and I don't know how many of the people from 20 years ago might remember that tune of the aqua guard when you are kind of filling that water. And I heard that tune after 20 years, and I'm like, this. It brought me so much joy to just listen to that and go back in time to some place that I perceive to be happier in the rear view mirror. So I think for a lot of people my age, I'm 31 at this point, it's that phase in life where I think you kind of come to the conclusion that, your quote unquote, some part of your youth is over, and now you have to kind of build a life that you want to live for the next 20, 30 years. And I think people struggle with that. And for me, therefore, the change has been in finding a partner, a community, whatever else that I can really get along well with.
And you mentioned when you heard the Aquaguard tune, you felt joy. And I'm wondering about that because, music from the past may bring back memories, may make me feel wistful, may reproduce the emotion of that time, and so on and so forth. Like, why joy? Do you feel that that past is something beautiful which is lost forever?
Look, I think to be fair, in the rear view mirror, everything seems good, right? So I think it's coming from that place that even when things might have been traumatic, things might not have been that pleasant. There's obviously selective amnesia, that you forget the bad parts and you remember the good parts a lot more. But more importantly, even things that I believe that you did not have such fond memories of in that moment, you still feel a certain amount of ownership. You feel a certain amount of ownership over your traumas, over your inadequacies, over your mistakes, etc. And I think what people go back to is typically that place where they have a lot more familiarity. So I think it's that familiarity which probably brought the joy listening to that Aquaguard music.
And to take another digression, that term ownership is interesting because most people, when you look around them, they don't take ownership. In fact, they're not even aware of what they may be feeling at a particular point in time and all of that. And I have been more and more in the last few years, perhaps, being intentional about taking ownership of who I am without being judgmental. So, if something makes me sad, it makes me sad. If I love something, I love something, and just accept that and don't always, this is who you are. And of course, you control the ways that you behave, but you are what you are. And is that a process that kind of took time? Because some of the things that you are claiming ownership of are not easy to. Many people would forget them. Like, I remember just speaking of trauma, like Amitava Kumar told me a story I keep going back to, where there was this village he had gone to, where at one point there were communal riots, and every Muslim in the village was slaughtered except one. And there was a guy who kind of ran off in one direction. Everybody else went to the fields, including his wife and kids, and they all got slaughtered. And I think a few years later, Amitava goes back there to see what's happened to this guy. And he's got another wife and he's living there and it's a completely normal life. And it's like that shit never happened. It's like, it's like a defense mechanism. It's perhaps something adaptive that we manage to compartmentalize. We manage to completely cut it out. And I think a lot of people, when they look back on their own lives, whatever their traumas might have been, or even less strong words, whatever they might have gone through at different points in time, whatever they might have felt, which objectively they are supposed to feel ashamed about, they would never have actually owned up to. Either they don't think about it or they think about it in a different way. And I just find that there is a lot of self-awareness and courage that it takes to actually take ownership. So can you tell me about that process for you of reflecting on yourself and figuring out all of this and saying, yeah, okay, I'll own it?
Got it. So here's how I think about it. I mean, all of us have skeletons in the cupboard. All of us have done things, experienced things that we are either not proud of or we would rather forget. And same with me. I think for the longest time, I kind of just beat myself up over some of these issues, and it has kind of sent me in a downward spiral where at some point I reached a point where I was self-harming, where I had to seek professional help. And this was fairly early in my life, which was in the early years of college. The way I would think of it is that I think we all are fairly good at being kind to others, especially people that we love. We forgive their mistakes. Something I also write about in the book, about how we are, as a culture, as a community, are taught about being forgiving, about being accommodative, etc. But sometimes we're not that accommodative for ourselves. So in the world that I come from, which is more of the corporate world, I think a lot of people really have so much anxiety about their career. Sometimes they beat themselves up. Did I make a wrong move? Should I not have taken this job? Should I have taken that job? Should I have prioritized money? Should I not have prioritized money? And people really take all of these questions and think about it a lot more in a way that affects both their quality of life, but more importantly, their ability to do what they're doing in that moment. So, over the past several years, at least the way I have found my comfort zone through all of that is to be extremely intentional and be extremely accommodative of my challenges. So, obviously, like anyone else, I've also made lots of career transitions, career choices, etc. And I try not to beat myself up over them, but rather take them as, at the very worst, a learning experience. Fortunately or unfortunately, most of the people who, for example, will be listening to this podcast in a country like India come from extreme privilege. Fortunately, I think the worst case scenario for many of us is actually not that bad in the grand scheme of things. So I try to think about how can we use that privilege both for our own happiness, that look, we have the risk appetite to be able to experiment, but at the same time, how do we channelize it in a way that we're not beating ourselves over something that happened in the past. So for me, therefore, that journey honestly took many years. I remember the first time I probably had to go on medication was about 2009. And it was almost a decade long journey. It came about in little bouts, but thankfully, what I've also had the fortune or turn to is, I think, the conversation around mental health over the past few years has become far more mainstream than where it was. Nowhere close to where it should be. But if I look back at how people in my community, my family, etc., approached in 2009 versus how they approached it maybe 2 months back is extremely different. So I think we're kind of getting there. And from a very personal point of view, I just feel that sometimes being stuck in the past is nobody wins. You traumatize yourself. So I'm sure that gentleman would have thought about that a lot when he decided to start a new family. But if there's nothing he can do about it, there's nothing he can.
And this process that you describe of beginning to love yourself, and I guess it can happen in two ways. And one is that you lift yourself up and you do everything with intentionality and you become the person you want to be, and then you can love yourself. And then the loving is easy, but the doing is hard. And the other way, and I'm just thinking aloud here, is that the doing is so hard that you don't really manage to do it. But you love yourself anyway because you're like, okay, with all my flaws and fucked upness and whatever, I'll take it. I'm trying my best and that's all I can do. Was it easy for you to arrive at that space where you could love yourself?
It's very difficult because so much of what my community's image of me was rooted in very tangible achievements. So I had, for example, in 2009, I had stood first in the boards, right? And that was the watershed moment of my life. Suddenly, I have like 10 media channels in my house fighting to interview me, and I'm going in a car and being chased by another journalist's car and all of that. And throughout all of that, I'm thinking, when am I ever going to experience this in life again? This is like the peak fame that I will probably ever experience. I'm not going to have like 10 news channels chasing me. And I remember that evening, one of the news channels that I was giving the interview to at that point, the journalist said, "Oh, you must feel like Brad Pitt." And I said, "Unfortunately, yes, but only for a day." And for me, therefore, and then other things happened. I also did, I stood first in the CAT exam, and then again, that show happened all over again, getting the Rhodes Scholarship and all of that. It's a lot of kind of type A things splattered all over my CV. So society's image of me was that, which is why when I have made somewhat unconventional choices, which was, for example, to move into the social impact space early in my career, etc., it's left people around me a lot more confused. A lot of people, in fact, recently I posted something on LinkedIn and a gentleman commented that, "Subhashish, it's tragic to see you waste your life like this and waste your potential like this." And those voices do get to me at some point. But I think the way that I have at least thought about it is that whatever you might have achieved in life is an outcome. It's not the input, right? So whatever good things happened in my life, and if I even look back to them, happened because I was a certain way. So I think it's that way of life that one has to preserve a lot more than the actual external markers. And so for me, it was important to identify what are these value systems that have given me joy in the past, and then saying, okay, I'm going to think a lot more. I'm going to be a lot more intentional about these value systems rather than the outcomes that those value systems led to. So, to summarize all of that, I think what's really important, at least my reflection of what is really important, is to not let yourself be defined by things that are less in your control, but to define yourself through a set of values that then are far easier for you to measure and far easier for you to control. So if I measure myself by, or my self-image is based on my professional successes, it's largely not in my control. Most of those things were a chance of pure luck. But I can control things like, how I interact with those around me. How do I spend my days? What are the, how do I approach my relationships? What are the values I hold dear? And those are things within my control. And I think that gives me a lot more agency. In all of this, because watch a lot of Bollywood movies, I go back to this Bollywood movie which I watched in mid 2000s called Door by Nagesh Kukunur. And in that, there's a dialogue that, look, if you have the, and I'm doing a very poor translation, but if you have the guts to make choices, you should also have the guts to live by the consequences of those choices. And I think that is something I keep reminding myself of, that we make so many choices every day, which friends to keep, which jobs to take, from the consequential to the trivial. And I think what becomes really important is for us to say, you know what, I'm going to see this through and I'm going to stick by the consequences of these choices that I make.
Wise words. And speaking of memories, you mentioned Door, and that song A Hausala just started playing in my head. Such a beautiful song. I love that song, and that kind of brought a little bit of joy to me. One of the phrases I learned in my recent episode with Gurvinder Bhogal, though it's not his phrase, but it's a psychology phrase, is the looking glass self, where we form our self based on the reflections that we see from other people of what they are seeing of us and all of that. And getting past that and finding yourself is tough. And I'm very intrigued by what you said about deciding that this is my value system and I will stick to my value system and I will live my life this way, and whatever happens happens, because that's not in your control, but this is how I'm kind of going to live. So can you elaborate a bit more on the value system, sort of your, whether it's in terms of your ethical system, or how you live your life, how you relate with people? How did you arrive at that firstly, and what is it?
Got it. So I think for anyone growing up, their parents become the first point of reference. And I think most of what I learned was just by observation, right? So I observed my parents, and obviously there was a ton that I saw which was amazing, right? My father, for example, comes from this deep sense of loyalty and belonging both to his family and his community. And in our political views, it might have taken us in opposite directions, but I thought that was something great to learn from him. For me, thankfully, very early in my life, I read Gandhi, and that's where I kind of got into thinking about life as a series of questions and experiments rather than outcomes. Constantly questioning my own value systems and trying to grapple with the complexities of things. So, for example, if I'm doing charity, am I doing charity because I'm a nice person and charitable, or am I doing it because after doing charity I feel good about myself? So I'm actually selfish while doing charity. So that's the kind of method that I adopted probably in high school or sometime, is to kind of start questioning all of this. A friend, am I being nice to the friend because being nice is a good thing? Am I being nice to the friend because somehow in the back of my head I have an ulterior motive? Am I being nice because I have some kind of professional thing to gain from them? So that's the methodology that I adopted in terms of thinking about this value system a lot more. At least where I've arrived is that there are certain things that I believe in which given my context are the right things, seem to me like the right things to do and bring me a lot of joy, right? So I get excited by this notion of service, of being of use to someone. That service might be a dog, that service might be another person. But where it comes, I also acknowledge that it comes from a great sense of privilege, that I am financially in a comfortable position, so I can do all of that. I've built up a career which I think makes things a little simpler for me, and therefore I'm able to do all of that. Not everyone will be able to do that. So therefore my second value system becomes one of what Gandhi called reducing yourself to zero, starting from the point of not making assumptions, not making judgments. So even things like if someone makes a different choice in their life, including, for example, going, maybe taking political or social views that I might not fully agree with, but approaching that with a certain amount of kindness and and curiosity rather than judgment becomes kind of that second value system. The third value system, honestly, is to look after yourself. That I feel like if you cannot look after yourself, then you cannot look after the world around you. And as much as people might think there's a certain amount of selfishness attached to that, I do not think that's true. I think you have, if you want to be, some sort of change in the world, you have to yourself be equipped to create that change in the world. So I think it's fairly important to be selfish.
I think a good selfish is one word, but a good metaphor for it also is that warning they give on airplanes when the air pressure goes down, and they say when the oxygen mask drops, put your own mask first.
Yes.
Because you're not equipped to help the other person unless you help yourself first, and you make sure you're kind of there. And you spoke of non-judgmental. Like, one of the qualities I like most about our mutual friends Ajay and Susan, and in fact we first met in their office when you gave a presentation about your book. And one of the qualities I love about them is they're so non-judgmental that once they have accepted you into their fold, they will simply just sit and listen. And you can tell them the worst things about yourself and think that, oh my God, this is going to change this person's opinion of me. And no, they still have just, and I thought I should mention that because it's personally sort of meant a lot to me. And even that notion of reducing yourself to zero reminds me in a different context, a writerly context of this story I've shared a couple of times on this podcast, but I'll share it again for my listeners and for you because it's such a lovely story. And this is something Prem Panikar once shared in a workshop he was doing for my writing students, where Prem spoke of this interview with this writer who was once asked, how does he find the focus to write? And that guy said that what I do is I go inside a room and I make sure I'm the only person in the room, and I shut the door and then I sit down. So the interviewer asked, so is that when you start to write? And he said, no, because physically there's no one with me. But there are all these people watching me with expectations and this and that. And I wait for them to leave. And then I wait for them to leave. And the interviewer says, oh, then you start to write. And he says, no, because there's still one person in the room and that's me. And I wait for myself to leave. And then the story tells itself. And I think that's so beautiful, but there is perhaps even in that concept of reducing yourself to zero a sense of vanity because it's almost impossible to do, right? So it's, that's kind of the weird thing there. Take me back then to that period where you're getting to college. You're going to Stephens. Like at this point, I'm guessing that you're still not settled on a sense of self. Like, what do you want to do? Who are you? What do you want to be? All of those things. Tell me a bit more about that shaping. What were those years like? Did you feel that you fit in naturally with your peers, or did you appear to fit in with them? Did you have to, what was that whole period like for you?
Got it. So my high school happened to be in one of the posh South Delhi schools, and funnily at some point we weren't sure whether we could afford to send me there, but my parents still decided to kind of take the punt and do that. So for me, a lot of my high school actually, in retrospect now, comes with a lot of trauma of feeling like not belonging there, because we didn't come from as much wealth as most people in school did. We didn't have access to the spaces, to the resources, etc. that people did. I remember when I was trying to apply for admissions to foreign universities, the counselor kind of laughed on my face and said, there's no way you're going to get in, which was true. I mean, I actually didn't. So she was right, but in a very demeaning way. So when I was going to college, for me, finally, I was actually getting to hang out with people who I felt a lot more belonging and attachment to, because St. Stephen's, like kind of many public universities in India, tend to be a lot more multicultural than for example posh South Delhi school. So for the first time I started then finding people who felt like me, who I felt like I could have a conversation with as equals, as people who believed in a similar set of things. So in terms of finding that identity, St. Stephen's became for me the place where I built a community built the safe home. I'm still very, very close to friends those are my closest friends. And even when I don't speak to them much, I know that if something's going wrong in my life, they are the ones who are going to show up, right? And so for me, that part of my life became home. And everything that I've gone on to achieve after that has been because I finally found a home in a certain group of people. And that's where it was. And of course, came with its own set of challenges, which was that, it is... Delhi University tends to be a fairly political space as well. And I don't think at that point I had the maturity to grapple with a lot more, and that came later in my life. But for me, that sense of home is something that started there.
And At this point, when you looked out in the future, what did you see yourself doing? Like, what did you want to do at this point? You're studying economics, but you said you really hated it and all of that. So, what were you good at? What did you think you're going to end up doing?
So, like many people who study economics, I had starry-eyed views that I'll join a multilateral institution and be a global developmentalist, and I'll earn and I'll travel all across the globe. And I think for most people who probably studied economics back in that time, probably even now, that is the idea that they have in mind. Somewhat, I might argue, in retrospect, simplistic, but you want to, work in the social development space, probably a multilateral institution, earn decent money, but still kind of make social impact, etc. So that is the notion that I had while being there. Funnily ended up at a management consulting firm because that was the best option out of college. But I think that also took me to places which I'm really fortunate to have gone to. Just to give you an example, the first project that I did under that in that at McKinsey was a project in rural Gujarat. And as much as in the classroom I had sat and read about labor laws and how they're good or bad, to actually go there and be in a factory setting and then see people make these daily trade-offs about, should I hire this person, should it be a contract wage, etc., for me brought economics to life. We might have studied so much globalization and good, bad, ugly, whatever in the textbook, but when McKinsey took me to a steel plant in Europe, and there we saw what goes into really building a global organizations, not just kind of from the mundane stuff of just setting up the factory and running it, but also the cultural aspects of it. How does power dynamic in these kind of settings look like? That brought it all to life. So for me, therefore, McKinsey in a very funny way ended up being almost like taking my economics learning into a lab and saying, okay, now things are starting to make sense. And that's when I decided I need to go back and study this again to figure out what I figured was right in whatever I figured out.
And that's fascinating. It reminds me of an experience I had maybe 5 years ago, where my friend Barun Mitra took me to a place near Nasik where there was a congregation of farmer leaders and politicians and all. And many of them were from the Shetkari Sangatana, which had been founded by Sharad Joshi. And it was really interesting and even inspiring to sit there and hear all of these people share the same ideas as I had, which is, freedom, free markets, liberty, all of those things, but which to them had not come from books in a top-down way, had not come in a theoretical way, but which had come from their lived experiences. That what happens when there are MSPs, what happens where there is, a monopoly on the agricultural marketplace, and so on and so forth. And they've lived through that world, and it's coming from there. And to watch sort of those ideas come from the ground up is really interesting. And segueing from this, I want to ask about the frames through which you look at the world and how those frames formed. This is almost one interesting example of economics in the classroom actually becoming economics on the ground. And I love your phrase, it came to life. And so tell me a little bit about how the way you look at the world began to form from there, because what you've done in your book is sort of brought a lens to it, which unfortunately not many Indians have. The default thinking here is statist and my bap knows best and command and control and all of that. And that is a conventional thinking. And yet you found it in yourself to build a new frame for yourself which challenges that thinking, and then kind of act on it and build cogent narratives around that, which eventually culminated in the book. But we'll come to the book later. But tell me about this process of frame building, and was it challenging given that most young people, even when it comes to economics, tend to be rather on the left, and at the same time you were seeing all of this play out on the ground and realizing the importance of freedom. So tell me a bit about that.
So 2 or 3 things, right? I think the first and most important thing to get to this frame is to cultivate the ability to deal with complexity and ambiguity, deal with a lot of gray. So again, just going back to the example of labor laws, and there are people who take strong positions on either side, but the truth is somewhere in the gray, right? You're making trade-offs. In fact, all of public policy is about making trade-offs. If it was obvious, then we would have most likely already done it. So for me, developing that ability to keep that complexity within myself and keep thinking about it became a useful thing, because I was obviously interacting on one hand with my friends and peers in the corporate world, and they would come with certain frames of reference. But I was also interacting with people in academia, people who've kind of been in social change movements, etc. And this obviously went into hyperdrive at Oxford. But that ability to just say, this is complex, I do not know the answer, and this is how I'll walk a little bit towards getting the answer, became the first frame of reference. So that thing that I referred to initially, which was my own value system, just having a very questioning and a curious attitude towards things, was also something that I think became important in forming my lens of the world, to constantly say, maybe I'm wrong, maybe there's a lot more gray, let me figure out what are the grays here. That became one frame of reference for me. The second frame of reference for me became essentially to think about who makes choices and who makes decisions. So when we are making a decision about labor laws, are people who are going to be most directly affected by it, are they going to be in the room or not? Do they have a voice or not? Who's making decisions about them? And there's obviously a lot of debate. Someone say, hey, look, a bureaucrat sitting in Delhi cannot be making decisions about people in rural Gujarat. But neither can someone who probably grew up in Delhi in wealth in all of their life and is now in academia. Also, is probably somewhat detached from the reality of those people. And obviously, in any kind of democratic setup, you have to use approximations while decision making, and though your representatives become those approximations. But how well does that process of decision making work? So that, I think, helped me shift my mindset from thinking about outcomes to processes. That wherever we land, did the person who's going to be most affected by it, did that person have voice or not? So therefore, I think of freedom not in these absolutist terms of, hey, if you have less government, we are more free. But I think of freedom as agency. That have I had the ability to participate in the decision? So if I go through that consultative process and I come up with a government where I decide, look, all of us democratically put together have decided to create, let's say, more government, more, let's say, universal basic income or whatever else. And some people might say, look, that's too much government and too much taxation, etc. But because I think of freedom as agency, for me, I think that is a relatively free society. They've chosen where they want to land up. So to that extent, I would say countries which have chosen to have more interventionist governments but have done that in a consultative and participative way are relatively free countries as well.
I think, something that makes me a little uneasy is the phrase countries that have chosen, because China can choose something, but has a country really chosen? The state has chosen. India can choose something, but it could be the majority which has chosen, or the majority community which has chosen, and not necessarily others. That's what makes, like, if one just defines democracy in terms of electoral democracy, it's like that famous cartoon of two wolves and a lamb voting on what to have for dinner. And obviously the lamb is fucked and there's no freedom there, right? It is what it is. But that's an aside. I get the nuance that you're pointing to, and that's an aside. I was also struck by the fact that you topped the board exams and you topped CAT, and I feel like immediately withdrawing my invitation to you to come on the show, because I have never had toppers on the show as far as I know, and I have always not liked toppers. I was a quintessential backbencher, as it were. But what strikes me as interesting is that to be a topper within the Indian education system, I guess what you would require is a certain doggedness in, and this is my stereotypical view, but a certain doggedness in absorbing facts and, seeking certainty and answers in everything that you do. And yet, this mindset that you point to, which is actually a really outlier mindset, very few people have it, where you're questioning everything, where you're embracing complexity and nuance and multitudes and all of that, because that takes a lot of intellectual energy as well, to be able to sort of grapple with that rather than, be satisfied with a simplistic view of the world. And this seems completely at odds with, the topper mentality, as it were. So, what is like, how were you topping all of that? Was there a drive to excel, and, topping these things was one way to do it, or,
One obviously doesn't plan for it, right? Because in a country like India, there are probably hundreds of thousands of people who probably worked as hard and are equally adept at that exam as you are. I wouldn't even call them smart. I think then I go back to this question of being able to handle those complexities in thought and in process. So even now, for example, I have half a leg in kind of the policy, non-profit, think tank space, and then half of the world in the VC space. And these worlds are diametrically opposite. The way they react to the same piece of news could, just completely different approaches. So for me, therefore, even as I was studying, one was just taking a very cold-blooded, calculative approach to that, hey, look, I need to do well here to be able to kind of get sufficient resources, etc. in life, because I didn't come from a place of abundance in my career. But also making sure that that kind of doesn't go to your head. For example, I actually topped CAT and then I chose not to go to any of the IIMs. I said, this is not the life I want to live. Sure, I've done all of that, but kind of let me put that, it's sunk cost, right? So let me put all of that aside and actually look at my decisions up front. And I think that's primarily where it came from. And to be fair, I think my approach in some of these things was also different. And that's when I realized that this whole notion of pursuit of happiness is what kind of leads to success. And again, going back to a Bollywood film, but what Three Idiots says, like you chase excellence and then success comes on its own. What I mean by that, for example, is that when right before the CAT exam, St. Stephen's in about 2011 was when we introduced LAN. So suddenly all the boys hostel and girls hostel and everything have LAN. And now this is 2 months before my CAT. And we are actually spending all night playing computer games. So 2 months before my exam and leading up to the exam, I actually stopped studying completely. And I just found myself in this very blissful position that everything else just happened, right? I think I went to the exam with just being extremely happy about life. And the same thing happened with my boards, where my parents had decided to move to Calcutta. So I spent the last year of my high school being alone in an army guest house. And it was an extremely traumatic period for me. But right before my boards, the last 2 months that schools are on vacation, I spent at home, and I just felt so happy that everything else just happened on its own. So that's what I advise to people. So I write a lot about careers and ways of living on LinkedIn, and I try to kind of post every week or twice a week. And this is what I write to people about. That at some level, it's only when you're really happy, when you really enjoy what you're doing, are you able to unlock some of these successes for yourself. So for me, that's where it came from. And therefore, for me, it never felt much of a challenge to have this side of almost like a left and a right side to my brain. Didn't feel that difficult.
And even with happiness, I mean, it's such a complicated term in the sense that if you are too intentional about happiness, you can overthink it and therefore it just becomes out of reach, right? Because, like, the moment, like, if you're having an ice cream and having an ice cream makes you happy, are you happy in the moment you're having the ice cream, or are you having in the moment that you decide you are happy because you're having the ice cream? And if you decide that you're happy having the ice cream, then you might start overthinking it and try to force yourself into feeling an emotion which you don't. And meanwhile, the ice cream is gone. So, but I'm guessing none of these complications were ever and sort of like.
I think they do happen, right? And at those points, I just think of it as an iterative process. Maybe I really like ice cream, but at some point I have seen a pattern of maybe 3 times back to back that I haven't enjoyed the ice cream. And maybe that's when I know that there's something wrong in my approach towards the ice cream. Now, there's one alternative, which is to fix the approach of you having the ice cream, or the other is to just look for other sources of joy. So I chose the latter path. It's much easier. I just believe maybe there's something in my approach towards having ice cream which no longer brings me joy. So let me shut that path and move on to something new.
Marvelous. So tell me about the Rhodes Scholarship. Like, how did that happen? Like, that's another like grade A academic achievement. Like, you top the boards, you top CAT. You don't go for him. You don't go to the IIMs, and then the Rhodes Scholarship. So at the time you applied for the Rhodes Scholarship, what was that process like, and what were you planning to do with it? Like, one thing many students may want is ki, okay, I want to go abroad and I'll do whatever it takes, and that is the aim. But for others, I want to get better at this and I want to study this. So this is something I'm really interested in. And then going abroad or even getting the Rhodes Scholarship becomes a means to an end, as it were. So how are you thinking of it, all of this?
So for me, firstly, one of the things I wanted to do was to study abroad. I wanted to experience living in a different country. I wanted to experience a different kind of educational system. For example, not too many people realize this in India, but in Oxford, actually more than half your academic year is vacation. So, and even when you're not on vacation, when you actually have your academic terms going on, they spend less than a couple of hours a day in class. And compare that, and there's no kind of attendance. You walk in when you want, you walk out when you want. Assignments are voluntary. There's no exam. This is one exam at the end, right? So that is something I knew about and I wanted to experience, because obviously, despite having an education system like that, obviously the university is done very, very well. So there must be something in that approach to life that makes that happen. The second thing was that the Rhodes Scholarship at that time used to have its motto as fighting the world's fight. And I'm like, hey, what is this scholarship which equips you to fight the world's fight? What does it do to enable you to do all of that? So I said, looks like a useful experiment, and the fact that I don't have to pay a penny probably doesn't hurt. So that's why I went for it.
So tell me about Oxford. Like, what did you do there, and what was it like? Like, what did you expect, and then when you landed up, what did you find? Like, how easy or difficult was it to sort of to make friends, to belong, as it were, and to figure out what you were doing there, and what was your place in the world, and all of these things?
So when I went to Oxford, it was a very difficult and tumultuous time for the entire Rhodes Scholar community, because that was the time when the Rhodes Must Fall movement was at its peak. There was a college in Oxford which had a statue of Cecil Rhodes, and Cecil Rhodes comes with a very, not, I wouldn't even say it's a contested legacy. It comes from a bad legacy, right? He's someone who's exploited people in Southern Africa, etc. So that was the point we were there. For us as Rhodes Scholars, that became a point of conflict, that, hey, we are benefiting from the wealth of this person, and that wealth has been built on the back of exploitation. So that was the context in which I was in Oxford, and that was honestly throughout my 2 years. We used to kind of keep thinking about this issue, especially those of my peers who were actually at the forefront of that movement, and how do you reconcile that with your own identity? And that, I think, led me to think about and try to answer a lot of questions around privilege. The second thing was, obviously, there was an academic line. I was doing the MPhil in economics, and it is an academically a very, very rigorous course. So how do you kind of embrace the academic rigor of that space while also doing this on the side? But most importantly for me, I think it was a period which taught me how to think. What I mean by that, for example, is that in India, for me, my sexuality was a question. In Oxford, it wasn't. I came out to people literally the second day I was there, and that for me flipped that mental model, where I finally started thinking about, hey, there are obviously all these restrictions you kind of put on yourself, but it's only when those restrictions go away that you're able to be a far fuller version of yourself, even if that may not be necessarily a happier version of yourself, but you're able to emote, express yourself a lot more. And so at this point, I was again just leading up to a lot of these ideas that I explore in the book, which was around how do we start dismantling some of these notions that are built within us. So, for example, another one is that in the UK, when I voted there twice, one during kind of Brexit and one during the general election, the process of registering as a voter and voting is so simple. I just had to fill up a form, and I got my the registration done in a week. And when I went to the voting booth, I did not have to show any ID card. I could just say, hey, I'm Subhashish. They ticked off my name, and I went and voted. Does that mean there's no fraud in voter elections there? Obviously, there is fraud in voter elections there. But is there consequential fraud in voter elections or not? And that's the question they grapple with. Whereas in India, the debate we have around voters' ID, for example, is should we link it to Aadhaar so that it's completely deduplicated? The question is not to cut down fraud in electoral systems to zero, but the question is how do you reduce it to an extent that does not affect the outcomes of those elections? So these are the kind of questions that just the experience of living there made me think. For example, also, should an ID card be mandatory to get a SIM card connection? Now, in India, we always make a law and order argument that, hey, look, you need to catch the thief, so therefore you need to provide your ID card while getting a SIM card. But out there, I didn't. And that made me question, hey, was my way of what I was assuming as truth, is that really true or not? So I think that for me became the really important part of my Oxford experience, which was to start thinking about a lot of these issues in a lot more detail.
And I kind of find it heartbreaking that you only came out when you went to Oxford and not in all your years in India. And I don't even know what to ask about that. It just feels heartbreaking to me that, it kind of worked out like that. How much did that sense of being an outsider in one particular sense, and one can feel like an outsider in many ways, one can feel one doesn't fit in across many different margins, like in your South Delhi school you felt that you were from a different class, you didn't fit in with all these elite boys, and this is another way of sort of not fitting in, though I would have imagined that in elite Delhi in the late 2000s this would not have been an issue, but I guess it was. How does that sense in all of these different contexts of being there but not quite there then affect the way that you look at the field that you're studying and you look at the things that you're doing. Because even earlier in the context of the labor laws, you mentioned that why should a bureaucrat in Delhi decide? What about the guy actually in Gujarat who's getting affected by it, whether it is a factory owner or the laborer, right? And those are the stakeholders who have skin in the game. So why the bureaucrat in Delhi? So do you feel that that kind of affects the way you look at every issue, where you don't have to take the default point of view, where you can take a different point of view? Like even within college, I'm guessing that there would have been academic fashions or ways of thinking, and there would have been the pressure to conform or whatever. And were you, have you always been the kind of person, or did you become the kind of person who could take a step back and, choose to look at things differently? And if so, was it easy or hard to articulate them, or are there some things you had to keep to yourself?
So, Amit, I think to a large extent, it wasn't a choice for me. Having to take a different point of view or experience in difference just came relatively natural for a couple of reasons. For example, when I was at Oxford, one of the things all of my peers said is, hey, you've worked at McKinsey, you've been bitten by the corporate devil, so you don't have a voice. Right? And that feeling of being othered, and let's be clear, like I come from great privilege. My father, again, was an officer in the armed forces. So I come from that great privilege. And despite that great privilege, I had this sense of being othered, being silenced, and also obviously my own identity. So for me, at least, that produced a greater sense of being able to empathize with people that otherwise I wouldn't have felt, because I know that all of us carry lots of unsaid experiences which we don't wear on our sleeves, and there's no way to figure out. And the last thing that we should be doing, therefore, is to be judgmental. And that's kind of the mental shift that happened with me in those years, and in fact in the years preceding that as well. So if you think, for example, even within the LGBTQIA community, there are people who are prominent, who are kind of going there and fighting these battles, and more power to them. But there's a lot of people who are part of the community but actually come from very, very different contexts. So how do you make sure their voices and their experiences and their preferences get reflected in all of this as well? That's what I've been thinking. I obviously have no good answer, right? This question of privilege is obviously a very, very contentious one. If you come to think of it, Gandhi was an extremely privileged man for his age. Ambedkar was obviously extremely privileged Dalit of his age. So even within these communities, we, come from these privileged backgrounds. But that discovery of truth by trying to kind of talk to people, by trying to give voice to people, by listening to people a lot more intently, I think has been critical, which is why, as you can imagine, most of my friend circle leans a certain way politically, which can sometimes feel intimidating for people who don't subscribe to that point of view or that value system. The key is, how do you at least engage in that kind of conversation? I've been in the US where I've seen on dating apps people saying, not dating Republicans.
Yeah.
Right? And I think when we as society descend to that, I think that becomes really challenging, because then we kind of stop having conversation and almost stop being less human. So these are the kind of thoughts that were playing out in my head as I was hurtling towards this book, and I almost make it seem like this was the end objective of my life. But yes, that's what was going on in my head.
Yeah, I mean, if one looks back in hindsight, everything seems kind of teleological, and you can say कि यहीं पे आना था. This was the end point. Curious also about what you mentioned of all your friends being predictably of a certain political bent, and I also wonder about political bents, in the sense that there almost seemed like these sort of hard-coded templates that are made, that if you are, for example, for freedom socially, you would probably not be for economic freedom, and vice versa. So most people, like you and I think would agree that if two consenting adults should be able to interact in any way as long as they don't harm anyone else. That holds true both in the bedroom and in the marketplace. But there is one political tribe that will stand for freedom in the bedroom only, and another that will stand for freedom in the marketplace only. And every political tribe in India is frankly against both, right? So how is that then? Because not only are you moving in different circles entirely, your corporate McKinsey circle, your VC circle and all that, plus your academic circle and your non-profit circle, who are obviously thinking in different ways, but there often seems that there is almost no common ground where there should be.
Got it. So the way I think of it is starting with an acknowledgement that all sides and all perspectives are valued and are necessary. I think of it as some kind of orchestra or symphony. Like in isolation, they might be somewhat jarring and pointless. But it's only when you put them together in this crucible of public policy processes does something great happen. So even though I might, for example, I might think that I'm centrist, but unless there's someone to the left and unless there's someone to the right who are also battling these battles, I don't think I'm going to be effective. So the first and most important thing is to say that and understand that public policy processes do not start with everyone agreeing to the same thing, because then you don't need a process at all. It is about people coming with different perspectives at different spectrums and being able to come to a conclusion that at least feels some sort of a happy middle ground, right? So that's point one of kind of coming to this consensus, or kind of understanding this better. The second thing is that as you go to these various aspects and these various perspectives, there's, I think, something that they have to offer, because none of us have really had the experience to be able to really think about things very conducively. What I've found lacking, for example, in a lot of people that I interacted with in the think tank space is a genuine appreciation for how businesses work. If we might say that, look, you must have data privacy and the right for deletion, etc. How many startups are actually able to invest and build their tech systems in such a modular way to be actually have the right to deletion? And I think that kind of appreciation can only come, if not by working in those spaces, but by at least keeping that conversation open. And I think one of the tragedies in public policy in India, at least as I have experienced it, is our willingness to take positions, but our unwillingness to understand positions of those other people. And to an extent, that's also true for the policy making process itself. That given we've not had a very good record of keeping those very consultative, I think we struggle to get all of these viewpoints heard in that same conversation.
And isn't a part of the problem of the policy making process, like, isn't it in a sense orthogonal to this, that it's really a battle for accommodation of different interests, some of which might conflict in some degrees, but not necessarily all. And it isn't really about the truth of what will work, or it isn't about some ideology coming into play. But when you get down to the nitty gritty of making public policy, you've got different people with different kinds of skin in the game. And then it's a negotiation, and whatever happens, happens. And often very little movement is made because you will reach so many sort of standstills.
So a couple of things. One is that I believe at least all public policy is not even getting to the truth, because what is the truth, right? It's always a trade-off. What is the right point in the trade-off becomes the question mark. And as you rightly pointed out, it is about these interest groups as well. And this is what we study in Economics 101, which is that, for example, if you have situations where a large mass of people are affected, but by only a little bit, so that they don't have the incentive to act, but there's a small group which is affected so much that they have an incentive to act, it's most likely the latter which is going to win. So obviously public policy processes come with their own challenges. But I think we have such basic things to fix in the way India approaches public policy that those almost seem like second order questions. If you look at, for example, laws, and how many of those laws that Parliament passes are preceded by public consultation, 89% are not. When regulators pass regulations, how many of them are preceded by any kind of public consultation? In the case of SEBI and RBI, more than 90% are not. So I think while some of these questions are important, we do also need to put the basic structure and the foundations in place before we even start answering those higher order questions.
Yeah, and sometimes, the processes are the basic plumbing. If you put the processes in place in a democracy, then, things can at least sort of flow. Take me to the next stage in your career, because you've written in this Instagram post about how, after your Oxford stint got over, you gave 50 interviews and were rejected in all of them. And then eventually had to kind of go back to McKinsey and explore stuff there. So what was that process like? Because up till this point, you seem to have gotten whatever you wanted. You board exams, you topped, CAT you topped and rejected IIMs, a Rhodes Scholarship you got, you're there in Oxford, you've done everything. Suddenly, right, left and center, they are just rejecting you. What was this phase like?
In retrospect, it was a great phase where at some point I said, look, I'm okay with doing a sales job. I'll call up the phone and try to sell people things, and that's okay. And I think it was really humbling. Initially, as those rejections started coming in, there was a certain amount of how dare they, Like, who do they think they are, right? Rejecting me? Have they looked at my profile, etc.? But that went on for about a year. So one is, this is my final year at Oxford, so obviously want to have a good time there as well. So how do you balance the sadness and anxiety in one part of your life, and you try to balance that with making the most of those few precious moments that you've got left in that place? So that was where I was. But secondly, just saying, look, I'm going to keep looking for a job, keep trying to get some place good. And at that point, I'd actually needed to be in England because I had a life-threatening condition. So and the medication for that, or the proper treatment for that, was available only in the UK. So I was actually desperate to stay in the UK. So that's just compartmentalizing life and being able to have some moments of joy in an otherwise miserable situation was something that I had learned at that point. The second thing that I learned at that point was the value of community and the value of networks. So my whole process with McKinsey in those days was, in fact, Brexit had just been announced. Obviously, McKinsey was in a very uncertain situation in London as well about how much they'll hire, how many people they truly need, etc. But I went back to a partner who was from the community, and I said, look, I need to be in England. And obviously, I've spent 2 years at McKinsey. Do you think I can have a chance? And he really guided me through the process. So for us to be able to turn to people who, as such, we don't share much in common with, but something, right? And in this case, we shared our experience as a member of the community. That is something that experience taught me as well. So I'm glad that happened in retrospect. It ended up well. I ended up in a place I really had a great 5-year stint in at Omega Network. But failing repeatedly just set me up, I think, for being a more well-rounded person, I would say.
And I wonder, do all of these experiences, being an outsider in different senses, these 50 rejections, all of these complications, do they make you more empathetic? Like somewhere, if there is in a parallel universe, if there's another Subhashish who hasn't been an outsider in any sense, who's gone through life smoothly, who's, topped the board exam, stopped CAT, gone to IIM, gone and done whatever, got the first job he applied for. Is that person fundamentally a different person, and perhaps even fundamentally a less rounded person? Because that person will not have the humility and the empathy and the compassion that only life can really teach you.
I would believe so, but I also believe that each of us probably in our life undergoes enough of these experiences to imbibe that. I think we just have to keep our eyes and ears open as to what that teaches you. My experience was that, yes, it made me a very different kind of personality. It funnily also helped set me up for success, or more success than I would have otherwise had in the corporate world. Which is, it was far easier for me to build bridges with people whose working styles or philosophies I did not agree with, but it helped me develop that muscle to be able to reach across the aisle. It helped me be a lot more contemplative about my own actions and be less certain. But I feel that most of us undergo enough experiences in our lives to be able to develop that perspective. We just need to keep our eyes and ears open and think about what we learn from these processes.
And what was the time at Omidyar Network like? Like, what were those years like? What were you doing there? Is it what you wanted to do? Did you find during that time that, hey, this is not really my thing, I want to do more things? Just take me through that journey.
Those are the best years of my life, because we decided that at that point, this is 2016, where Aadhaar has been around for about 7 or 8 years at this point, but Aadhaar is now picking up. It's now becoming far more integral part of an Indian's everyday lives. Other countries are looking at it. It's leading to this question on data privacy. For me to find myself in the right place at the right time was amazing. So Omidyar Network at that point was setting up their vertical on digital identity, and I became employee number 1. So along with the partner who set that up, I was actually working on these set of issues. And for me, that was interesting because suddenly I was participating in something that's really an inflection point for India. And I think Aadhaar obviously has set a whole bunch of conversations that's had a ripple effect, both positive and negative, on how we experience our lives as Indians. But to be there in 2016 and think that you can participate in that became really important. So for those who don't know, Omidyar Network India is a philanthropic organization which does both for-profit and non-profit investing. I was helping build out this vertical on digital identity, which means that we funded a lot of non-profits who were working on these questions. We funded a lot of large-scale surveys that hadn't existed. But you're also looking at companies which are working in the privacy tech space, which are helping make Indians more capable of controlling their data privacy. So for me, that professional experience of being at a place where you're actually having consequential and tangible impact, yet dealing with the complexities of that time and being in a somewhat unique position, because even the Aadhaar debate was extremely polarized. There were some people said this is God's gift to man, and this is India's gift to the world, and this is the best thing that's ever going to happen to India. And then there were those who said, look, this is the start of a dystopian future. How do you try to kind of keep both of these perspectives in your mind? And I think that's we ended up building a fairly substantial body of work. We funded something called the State of Aadhaar Report, which is the largest survey on digital identity anywhere in the globe. That was used both by the critics who said, look, here's now the true extent of exclusion that we have. And that was used by the government, which said that, look, there is broad-based support for this program. So that experience helped me be far more comfortable in being in that middle ground, which is at some level comforting, but at some level really discomforting because both sides kind of abuse you.
Why are both the polarized positions on Aadhaar wrong?
I don't think they're wrong. And I think, in fact, in the public policy space, they're absolutely important. If those didn't exist, then I think we would have been...
Or rather, to rephrase my question, what do they miss? Each of them.
Again, I think on what the people who kind of oppose Aadhaar in its entirety, I think, do miss the question that, look, we in India are in a state of very selective state capacity. I think our state capacity is effective only in those kind of big projects. We have to do elections every year, if we have to organize the Kumbh Mela and all of that. And that's where the Indian state shows great state capacity. But into the day-to-day experience of citizens, there's relatively poor state capacity. One way to increase state capacity is technology, and Aadhaar being one of those tools that helps increase state capacity. I do think that those who were fundamentally opposed to Aadhaar at some level miss that inevitability of that happening. At some point in this age, in the age of technology, the state is going to build state capacity through these tools. And perhaps instead of opposing it in its entirety, what we should perhaps potentially look at is how do we build societal capacity to be able to balance that state capacity as well? How do we reduce the flaws of the system, but also build civil society capacity to be able to do this? So I think that's where those who opposed Aadhaar lock, stock and barrel missed. And for those who were like on the Aadhaar bandwagon that this is the greatest thing to happen to humanity, I think what they definitely missed was a greater appreciation of how the dynamics that work out at the ground level. So while one of the big planks of Aadhaar was, hey, this is going to disintermediate and take intermediaries out of the equation, I think what they missed was the intermediaries actually had a dual role. They weren't always these extractive people who are taking money and getting your job done, but they were also people who were helping others navigate otherwise complex systems. So, and once you take the intermediary out, and when there is a villager or someone in a remote area directly trying to interface with a centralized system somewhere in Delhi or in the state capital, and they have no way to bridge that gap, that becomes a challenge. So I think these nuances of the everyday realities of India was something that people who came at this with a very technocratic lens were missing.
And during this experience, you must have learned a lot about how we talk to each other. Like, if anything, the world has got more and more and more polarized today, right? And the question then comes is, number one, how do we talk to each other? And how do you enable that if you're someone in the middle like you were? And number two, where the policy is actually being made. Is there more talking happening there? Because one impression that one could have is that a lot of the polarized shouting is on social media and it's just for posturing and there's a lot of loudness there. But when actual serious people get to the table, it's more consultative and they're more accommodative. So is that true? What's your sense of that? How do we talk to each other?
Got it. So 2 or 3 things, right? At a very personal level, those first few years, especially as someone in their mid-20s, was fairly difficult for me because, again, some people were saying, hey, you guys are committing crimes against humanity by supporting Aadhaar, which I don't know what that meant. But things like that, again, a lot of people who were anti-Aadhaar refusing to even talk, or at least even when they talk, kind of taking a very aggressive perspective or an aggressive approach to even interacting with me. And at some level, I felt like, look, I'm still a human at the other end of the table. Can we kind of speak human to human? But I think what that taught me was being empathetic to their situations, just having a thick skin, right? So a lot of the people that I met who had been in what one might call the anti-Aadhaar camp were initially very standoffish, but I think over time, some of them have become some of my best friends and mentors, right? And they've been really supportive, including in kind of contributing their time to this book. So at a personal level, that was, unfortunately, we live in an era of polarization where it's really important to develop a thick skin. But now to your more important question about the policy making process itself. And let's remember that Aadhaar was something that was introduced as it did not have a legislative backing from 2009 to about 2016. And even when it was introduced as a money bill, which basically cuts off the Rajya Sabha from that entire conversation. That was also a point where one starts then thinking about, hey, what would have been in retrospect the right way to actually implement this? And that's when I kind of got attracted to this work that Ajay Shah and his group were doing, which is around regulatory governance, that there has to be a legal basis. You cannot have a system rolled out for 7 years in a large and consequential system like this without a law. But even when you decide to introduce a law, you have to have public consultations on that. I don't think what people showed on social media was necessarily posturing. Maybe for some of them it was, and maybe to some extent it was. But I am privy to information where I know that even in closed circles, those conversations became contentious very quickly in a way that even both sides, where they felt like they could acknowledge the merits of the other side's argument, refused to speak about it because they're like, if we start speaking, it's just going to become really emotionally draining. And I think that's where this conversation on Aadhaar then started taking two tracks and then kind of started reconciling once the Supreme Court hearing started. So we are not getting away from that, right? The age of polarization is upon us. It is going to get worse and worse. What we need to start doing is a culture and systems and processes to actually hear the other side. Culture is a long-term project. Maybe we'll get there, maybe we won't. But at the minimum, let's start talking about the systems and processes that at least these voices kind of get heard in the process. That's why, for example, should the Aadhaar bill have been open for public consultations? Once they got input, should they have published the inputs? Should they have responded to each of the major inputs that they received? These are the questions that I think as a country that we should be asking, especially, as you rightly said, in this age of polarization.
And do these systems and processes lead to the culture changing?
It's a very complex relationship because if you look at what the existing literature or institution says, that it is typically the informal institutions, the cultures, the social norms, etc., which influence the formal institutions, not necessarily the other way around. But let's also then go back to the Indian experience itself. Like, while we might believe that we are the mother of democracy, etc., at least in the Middle Ages, that wasn't our experience. That we'd been coming off a lot of monarchy, which wasn't on its way to being changed. So democracy itself was a formal institution that was imposed. And now one might argue that even despite its limitations, at least as an electoral democracy, that has seeped into the culture of our country. So I do believe that, in fact, India's own experience shows that once you set the formal institutions in place, sometimes it does percolate down to the informal institutions as well, and then starts becoming more of a virtuous cycle. And therefore, I do think that as we start getting into this notion of doing more public consultations, etc., it is going to lead to differences in the way people approach this. The reason, for example, one might argue that at this point a lot of young people don't participate in the policy process is because they might think of it as an exercise in futility. Why should I do it if my voice is not going to be heard anyway? But if they know that, for example, there's either going to be a bureaucrat or a bot sitting somewhere that's going to read my comments, maybe they will feel more engaged. So I do think that these changes in these formal institutions do eventually at some level come back and change the informal institutions as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And another way in which I speculate that culture can be determined by institutions, and tell me what you think of it, is really comes from an observation I think Jagdish Bhagwati made a long time ago about circa 2000, I think, I forget when, that he described China as having a profit-seeking mentality and Indians as having a rent-seeking mentality, a zero-sum kind of exploitative mentality. And I can't speak about China as well, but India, even today, it's certainly kind of true that many people, when they think of doing a business, when they think of of doing a project, it's an exploitative mindset. Ki, let's go out there and make some money at someone's expense. Let's pull a scam. Let's do whatever. At a lower level of thinking. You might not have come across much of that in your elite VC circles, but that's almost a default sort of mindset with many people. And me and a friend of mine, Kumar Anand, were once speculating about why it is not necessarily ingrained in Indian culture, but the way it might have come about is because of the institutions set in place after independence, where the state has so much power. And the one way to make money is by exploiting others, by rent seeking, and so on and so forth. And then automatically that shapes your behavior, and that shapes your behavior across generations, and will perhaps take generations to change. Right? So, what do you think of that?
Absolutely. And in fact, we go back much before independent in India's institutions and go back to even colonial institutions. And of course, there's been enough empirical work which shows that in colonies that the Europeans said, look, we're going to settle. They set up different kinds of institutions, which were far more inclusive institutions. And whereas in Africa and Asia, where they knew that they're not going to settle in the long term, they set up extractive institutions. Now, those extractive institutions are not only in the economic sphere, but also, for example, in the way that the police was set up. The way the police was set up in India, for example, was that there is a central command which basically takes this force and then deploys it to control the population. That continues to affect through the 1861 Police Act, which has now been replicated in many different states and is still the kind of where we get most of our police laws from. That ideally the police that we see on the street should be someone that should have some kind of local ownership, should have local oversight. But no, for our states, it's always kind of responding to that center, or in this case, a state capital that is sitting far away from people. So I think this notion of not extractive to some extent, but this notion of controlling institutions is something that we possibly inherited from the British, who kind of set it up as a way of controlling their population. And as folks like Gautam Bhati and others have written as well, that the constitution we adopted at the end of the day was a 75% just a cut, copy, paste of the Government of India Act that the British has brought about. So we did take that structure, and even as we put new people and Indian people in that structure, but very soon the structure took over and then resulted in a lot of the control that we continue to experience in our economic, political, and social lives.
Yeah, and that's a great point about, where the colonial powers decided to settle and where they weren't settling. And it reminds me of Manker Olson's great phrase, roving bandits and stationary bandits, where roving bandits were bandits who would just go, rove into a village and they'd rob it and they'd leave, and they had no plan to stay there. So they would leave nothing. They would destroy everything, take everything, scorched earth. But stationary bandits were bandits who actually would invade a village and they would stay there. So it was in their interest to build institutions, to build a system, to make sure that, even if they take the golden egg, the goose that lays the golden egg kind of remains. And I think in a sense, like I'd once written a column about Naxalism in the Northeast, and it struck me while reading about, places in the Northeast which are, or the east of India, which are Naxal areas, that there is no stationary bandit. The state is effectively absent, and both the state and the Naxalites are effectively roving bandits. And sometimes the Naxalites will actually set up little institutional things and play the part of the stationary bandits. So a really sort of interesting battle there.
Absolutely. And I think that is the path dependency that I think a lot of people, especially a lot of young people, are not necessarily aware of, right? I mean, we think of whatever problems we see now as problems of here and now, but I don't think we think as deliberately about how these problems have a certain path dependency and context behind that. So recently, for example, Rahul Gandhi's disqualification because of criminal defamation became a big thing. But kind of what is the path that led to this? Why do you even have criminal defamation in our laws, right? What's the history and what's the context, and therefore how do you make the case that it should be changed? I think those kind of stories enough people don't know about. When they speak about, we see enough of sedition cases these days. What's the history of sedition? How was sedition used against Gandhi and Tilak and all of that? Those are parts of our history that in a way have become absent, and I think it becomes therefore important for us to really talk about these issues and these contexts a lot more.
Yeah, and just to sort of double click on the sedition law, which is, being so successfully used by this government, successfully for them. And I did an episode with Ripur Daman Singh where we spoke about the First Amendment of those 16 stormy days, which was brought in by Nehru and was a severe sort of curtailment of free speech. And you have a great para in your book, which I'll read out. In May 1950, Nehru himself introduced the First Amendment, which added to the Constitution 3 more restrictions to free speech: public order, friendly relations with foreign states, and incitement to an offense. All of them, especially the first one, provided a lot more discretion to governments to restrict the free voices of citizens. The amendments were heavily contested in the Constituent Assembly but passed because of the government's brute majority. The prophetic words of Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, the founder of BJP's predecessor, summed up the concerns well. He said, quote, "Maybe you will continue for eternity, in the next generation, for generations unborn. That is quite possible. But supposing some other party comes into authority, what is the precedent you are laying?" Stop quote, which are such prescient words because some other party has come into power and now, it's being used against the Congress. And of course, the First Amendment drastically reduced free speech in India and enabled the return of sedition. It didn't bring the sedition law back, but it enabled it after that. And the sedition law had actually been struck down by the courts before this. So for a lot of the absence of free speech in the country and just continuing the colonial apparatus, we do have Nehru to blame, except that Mr. Modi shouldn't blame Nehru because he is benefiting from Nehru's largesse to him over time, as it were.
And I think that's true across the spectrum, right? And I think of it as the great continuity of the Indian state, that irrespective of who's in power, I think there are a lot of these common patterns. A lot of the people, for example, recently have criticized the office of the governor. In fact, I feel like every year the Supreme Court has one or two judgments where it criticizes the role the governors have played at the state level. But again, let's go back to the time, that misuse of the governor's office started with Nehru with the dismissal of the Kerala government, but also peaked during Indira Gandhi's time. And if you go back to the Constituent Assembly, that was the only major decision of the Constituent Assembly that was reversed. So in all their wisdom, our lawmakers thought that it is a better idea to have the central government just freely appoint a governor rather than have people locally elected. So that's kind of one of those aspects of the great continuity. The second aspect of the great continuity, for example, is the restrictions on art. And a lot of people obviously now feel that, hey, look, the government is kind of interfering and there's this culture and there's this atmosphere of fear. But the first book that was censored in India was again by Nehru. And it was a book where basically it was a retelling of the Ramayana. And then his government came in and banned that book. So clearly, whatever we experience right now and whatever be our dissatisfactions, not just with the central government, but even with the state governments, which have a whole set of powers of their own, we will find some historical precedents. That is not to say that things are exactly the same and things haven't gotten worse or haven't gotten better. One might argue that, hey, look, the sedition cases have gone up from, it was somewhere around in the mid-30s per year in 2014 to about almost tripled over the years. And that might be true, and there might be places where things have possibly gotten better. So, for example, dismissal of state governments after the mid-1990 judgment of the Supreme Court has come down a lot. So, things get worse, things get better. But I think the very crux of the structure of the Indian state has remained the same. And people might argue that in the economic sphere, for example, we have changed. We've gone from a socialist economy now to a free markets economy. But let's be clear that we have been in consonance with the great consensus of that era. Even when we were a socialist country, socialism was a very popular economic system. So it's not like we've taken some dramatic shift where the rest of the world hasn't. Most of the world moved towards globalization in the 1990s and free markets. And we just followed them or we led them or whatever else. That, I think, is something that we miss. And certainly what Shyama Prasad Mukherjee said has turned out to be true, not just with regards to the First Amendment, but with regards to so many other things. And this is what, even today, when we have discussions on public policy, one of the things that we must remind each other is that if we set up a new regulator, you and I are not going to be people who are going to be manning a regulator. It will be a bureaucrat who's sitting in Delhi, distant from all of us. So let's think about the structures and processes rather than about the people and their motivations.
Yeah, and we tend to forget how uncertain and fragile are so many of these things which we take for granted. Like a phrase that you've used in your book, you've quoted Gautam Bhatia, constitutional morality, right? But the point is, these guys have or will have the numbers to change the constitution. And therefore, then what happens to your constitutional morality, right? You can't treat something as a holy book, and the Constitution, of course, is itself incredibly imperfect in terms of the protections it gives to individual freedoms and so on, and we'll discuss that more. But then, to treat something as a North Star when it is itself imperfect and when it itself may not necessarily have legitimacy very soon, just because it's your preference, seems kind of weird. And I often say, harking back to the point of how it's not necessarily the people in power, but the system of government. I often say that to me, there are three things that worry me about India. And the first is subjective. The first is a party in power. I don't like them. That's my personal view. You can disagree. That's perfectly fine. That's the first of the three. And I think it's the least important of the three to me. The second is our fractured society, and especially how it's getting more and more fractured today. And that worries me a great deal, and it is a very big deal. And especially in the context of the anti-Muslimness that we see around us and the hatred that is spread. And I don't even know if that's reversible, but it's a hugely worrying deal. And the third one is really what your book is about, the dysfunctional state, that a lot of the things we blame on this government or that government or whatever flow automatically from this beast that is a state. That is how the incentives are. Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts, absolutely. They are all playing that game. They will all be the same. It is so easy to appear virtuous when you're in opposition, especially when you're there for a long time. But when you come to power, you're going to start behaving the same way, as we've seen with all these parties.
I completely agree with that. I mean, but I take a slightly more optimistic point of view that at the end of the day, we are still a very, very young republic. We only have a history of about 7 or 8 decades of having tried to do this and try to do it better, and things do improve. The RTI movement is a great example of that. Of course, one might argue that it's one of the few examples of that. But if you look at the history of the US as well, that they've had so many decades and centuries to be able to do this better. The British have had many more centuries to be able to do that. So I take a little bit of optimism from the fact that we are a young republic, and to that extent, a lot of the problems that we experience and see are the birthing pangs of a relatively young country as well. And these are not necessarily issues that are unique to India, but I do think the Indian context, like any other country, the Indian context we've experienced is unique. So we will take some time to think through this. What becomes important, however, it's not going to obviously happen on its own. And this is what, in the book, The Narrow Corridor, the authors write very powerfully, is that it's a constant battle to be able to stay within that narrow corridor of economic prosperity and civil liberties. And it therefore becomes incumbent on people, on the citizens, to be able to kind of get into this habit of questioning, this habit of holding people to account. And there's been quantitative evidence that shows that even in monarchies, where obviously civil liberties are extremely curtailed, a more complaining citizenry actually leads to better outcomes. So I have hope. I think it's going to be an interesting few decades to come, but our ability as a community, as a group of citizens, to be able to get better at asking for these kind of safeguards, changes, etc., will become fairly important.
There's a phrase, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, that kind of defines me. Like, I see myself playing the long game, even though in the long term, I know I'll be dead. But it's good to see, optimism of the intellect as well. And we'll celebrate that by taking a quick commercial break. And on the other side of the commercial break, we'll finish off a little bit of your personal journey and then talk a lot more about the book. Have you always wanted to be a writer but never quite gotten down to it? Well, I'd love to help you. Since April 2020, I've enjoyed teaching 27 cohorts of my online course, The Art of Clear Writing, and an online community has now sprung up of all my past students. We have workshops, a newsletter to showcase the work of students, and vibrant community interaction. In the course itself, through 4 webinars spread over 4 weekends, I share all I know about the craft and practice of clear writing. There are many exercises, much interaction, and a lovely and lively community at the end of it. The course costs rupees 10,000 plus GST, or about $150. If you're interested, head on over to register at indiauncut.com/clearwriting. That's indiauncut.com/clearwriting. Being a good writer doesn't require God-given talent, just a willingness to work hard and a clear idea of what you need to do to refine your skills. I can help you. Welcome back to The Scene and the Unseen. I'm chatting with Subhashish Bhadra on his wonderful book, Cage Tiger, and so far, in fact, on his life and times more than the book, but we'll get to the book soon enough. But let's finish that part of the journey where you're at Omidyar Network, you're doing all of these interesting things, and where do you go from there, and eventually, where does the idea of the book come from? What compels you to write it?
So while I was at Omidyar Network, we started funding a lot of think tanks in this tech policy space. So we were funding organizations in Delhi, Bangalore, etc., a group of India's leading thinkers to think about issues around data, around digital identity, both from a very technocratic way of how do you think about data privacy, what are the systems and processes, etc., to also around more societal ways, or what does it even mean to be a citizen in an increasingly data-fying country? What happens when your identity becomes a set of data points rather than who you are as an individual? Does it take away individual autonomy, liberty, etc.? So these are bunch of interesting questions on which we funded a whole bunch of think tanks. Some of those then started also researching around regulatory governance. How do you set up a data protection authority of India? What should be the powers of this data protection authority? That was my initiation into thinking about regulatory governance as a space, because again, a lot of people come into this saying, look, I know what the right answer is. I know this is how the data privacy law should be. I know this is how you should think about AI regulation. But not enough people are talking about what is the process through which you get to that. What is the systems that you follow to be able to get to an answer? And that's when we funded things around regulatory governance, I got interested in this set of questions. And once you adopt that lens to life, it's very difficult to look away. Then you start seeing institutions behind every headline that you see. So, for example, I was reading the India Today magazine, and it had something around the state of Tamil Nadu and how they are reforming their department which handles temples. And then you start thinking about, hey, under what law is this? Why do you have the state regulating temples? What processes and systems do they follow? What checks and balances do they have? So I think thinking about institutions was a new lens to life, which I got at the time that I was working at Omidyar Network India. But at the same time, I was also funding startups that were working in the data privacy space, who were building technologies that can be adopted by companies, by individuals, etc. And again, that exposure to both sides, one around the policy and the thinking side, one around the implementation side, was something that was, at least in my worldview, giving me somewhat of a more holistic point of views on some of these issues. That's when I started reading a lot more about regulatory governance around institutions, and also thinking about its interface with our day-to-day life. So while enough has been written about institutions, Pratap Bhanu Mehta, Devesh Kapoor, Milan Vaishnav, all of them have done fantastic work around public institutions. But when I was speaking to my brethren in the VC space, in the startup space, I don't think there was as much of an appreciation for these things. It was either seen as too boring, dull, dry, whatever, or it was being seen as something that, hey, somehow doesn't concern me, because that's something the academics and policy wonks are going to take care of. The idea behind the book was simple, which is, can we at the same level maintain the rigor that was being discussed in these academic circles, but make this far more understandable for a Gen Z and a millennial audience? And that's when I started writing this book. So this book is almost written in a conversational style. And when I was writing this book, the pen picture I had in my mind was that of my brother. Again, my brother also comes from a very similar community. He's a startup founder in Mexico. And I was writing as something that would resonate with him, that he could understand, that he could read without it feeling too heavy for him. So that's the attempt, and that's the fine walk that I've tried to do in this book.
That's a fascinating insight about keeping your brother as a target. Like many of my writing students often ask that, who am I writing for? And sometimes it's easy to define. Like if you're writing for the Times of India or the Wall Street Journal, you have a broad sense of who your audience is. But sometimes it's not. And one proxy that I can tell them is, imagine someone who is as intelligent and knowledgeable as you, with the same sensibilities as you, but they don't know that particular thing you're writing about. And that's perhaps a good starting point. And you kind of went one step ahead and just picked your brother, who I imagine is a lot like you, really smart guy, but won't know the stuff that you're talking about.
Exactly, in similar cultural context, similar exposure, etc., but has built his life and expertise in a different way. The other thing that I find very useful is to just prioritize. there was a version of writing this book which would have appealed more strongly to people in the think tank space and the intelligentsia. And the ability to say, look, that's not the book I'm writing was also for me a big part of that. So it's deliberately written in a language that may not appeal to that audience as much, but I think at least for the audience I'm writing it for, hopefully works for them.
Did your process of writing it improve your thinking about it and your thinking in general?
Absolutely. And I think it, in that sense, is a two-way process, and not just the book. Even writing on LinkedIn, which I do far more frequently, is something that helps me start articulating things better. And I learned this from some of my peers and my managers. So someone I worked with and looked up to would actually spend a lot of time even thinking about a LinkedIn post. That, what is the main point of that? Am I getting that across or not? Am I using the fewest number of words to get that across? Is it readable? Is it interesting, etc.? And that, I think, in a way also, once you start thinking about, am I communicating clearly or not, it helps you to start unpacking the arguments that you are trying to make in a way that then also helps you strengthen them. So as you start trying to force yourself to write clearly, and as you start writing those arguments, and you realize, hey, look, this argument is not actually making sense when I break it down, so let me not have it, or let me refine it. So that two-way process between the writing of the book as well as articulating your thinking a lot better, I think certainly helped. So even this framework that I've come up with the book about what are good institutions, the process of writing it and applying it to these different areas, at some point I realized, actually in this context it's not working, so let me go back to my assumption and or change the way I think about good institutions was part of the process. And obviously when I did your writing course as well, this is something that we explicitly spoke about a lot more, about being a good writer forcing you to be a good thinker and vice versa.
Wow. Yeah, and where does strikes a chord, like your colleague working so hard on his LinkedIn posts, and I think of Paul Graham's essays, and I love his essays, and they are written with such clarity that you imagine that it must have flowed out of him at one go, but he actually spends weeks on each essay, and he'll show it to people, and he'll get their feedback, and yet when you see the final product, not a word is out of place, everything just makes sense. It's like a miracle of craft.
And which is why I believe even tweets, for example, can be extremely difficult to write if you come to think of it. But the clearest writing, the simplest writing is often the most difficult thing. And I still think I'm just scratching the surface of good writing, because I still think it feels, to me, not as clear as it should be. And that's the challenge. It's really, really tough to really be a very clear writer.
No, man, you're being hard on yourself. I enjoyed reading the book thoroughly. Tell me a bit about your figuring out the craft and the voice for the book. Like, were there any models of similar books where you said, ki, haan, seeing like a state or this or that, and it should be like this? Were there any models you looked at that you said that, okay, this has the right kind of voice or the right kind of clarity, or, a book on a similar subject? What do you look at? And then when you start writing, did it fall into place right at the start, or was there a process of iteration in finding your tone and voice?
Got it. So the first and foremost thing that I came up with the book was the title. And I first thought of the title because this very instinctively and intuitively appeared before me. Once I got that, I think the most important thing was go back and understand what is the lay of the land, what are other people saying. So while I did not find anything that was in the tone that I wanted to write my book in, but I understood what were the other tones and narratives that were there, and most importantly, in engaging with what one might think is the quote-unquote other side. So on one hand, I read Kapil Komireddy's work, and that is obviously written in a far more evocative way, right? It's meant to provoke you and to think, wake you up and make you think about India very differently and be concerned. And then at the other end, I read A New Idea of India, which many people argue are like the intellectuals of the right side. And it says, look, we are now entering this much better age, the golden age, the revival of the Indian Republic. For me, I think, the level at which the book stood, those two books, for example, became inspirations in the sense that they were talking in completely opposite ends of the political spectrum about the grand narratives of nation building. So it was not in the weeds, but it was talking about something that's very kind of fundamental and ingrained to what we're doing. But at the same time, at the other end, I was reading a lot of book around the kind of the nitty-gritties of public policy. So Ajay Shah's book, In Service of the Republic, then the Transformative Constitution, the book on the Great Repression. So reading all of these obviously gave me a lot more contextual knowledge, but in terms of the tone, I wanted to aim for something that's kind of sits in the grand narrative scheme of things rather than in the nitty gritties, and that's what I've tried to create here.
And given that you have a day job, like how did you manage the aspect of discipline? Like when did you work? Did you have particular times of working? Was it hard to motivate yourself? Because it must be really tempting after every hard day at work to say fuck it. Or even if you wake up early in the morning to write, to look ahead to the hard day and say, "Arey man, yesterday was tough. Let me sleep for 1 hour more." How do you manage that?
Got it. So the great thing that happened to me was in the middle of the pandemic, our office decided to give us 1 week off for Diwali. So that was the time when I went to a remote place in Coorg, and I wrote without thinking, where is it going to publish? I wrote without thinking, is this making sense or not? I just brought 30,000 words in a Word document. So at least that gave me the sense that, look, this is something I can do, right? It doesn't seem that intimidating. So in a week, I kind of just wrote those 30,000 odd words. Eventually, I rewrote all of them. After those first 30,000 were done, it was a process of doing this every weekend. As you rightly said, after a long day at work, even if you motivate yourself, you just won't have the clear mind to be able to write really well. So for me, the writing process therefore happened primarily over weekends. So I would write about 4 or 5 hours every weekend and just keep chipping away at it. And I think just that compounding works very beautifully, where within a year, I was able to get through the entire book, including the actual, process of getting an agent, getting a publisher, etc. All of that very beautifully just happened within a year just by working over weekends.
Yeah, and for people listening to this, if the 30,000 words in a week is intimidating, which it sounds even to me, but the advice I give my writing students, as you would have seen in the course, is just write 200 words a day. Right, 200 words is nothing. That's how much we speak in a minute. You can do it on your mobile phone while you're on your way to the airport. But the power of compounding works there. 200 words a day can come to approximately 75,000 words in a year. That's a novel length thing. And of course, you don't necessarily have a novel, but you've written a lot of words. You've gone to the writing gym, and you won't just write 200 every day. If the 200th word is and, you won't be like, ki, aaj ka kota khatam, kal sentence complete karenge. Sometimes you'll go with the flow and you'll go on and whatever. So, my advice to anyone who wants to write something is that just start a writing habit. Just write 200 words a day, 300 words a day. It doesn't matter how much you fall off the wagon. It's easy to get back on. Don't sort of read about writers like Simenon would write 7,000 words a day for 7 days. That's how all his Romana Dur, his serious novels came about. Or you writing 30,000 in a week, which is ridiculous. I'm so jealous. But, you can set smaller targets, and the power of compounding completely takes over.
Absolutely, Amit. And I think the key part to what I was saying was the fact that I actually rewrote all of it. So it was actually really, in retrospect now, not very good quality writing, but just putting it out there, let your thoughts and your emotions or whatever you feel just free and put it on paper, I think then gives you a lot of room and gives you a lot of confidence. So I think most people that I've spoken to about writing the book, typically whenever they think about writing a book, get intimidated by having to churn out those 50, 70, 90,000 words. And as you rightly said, it's just, that first few thousand words that feel difficult. By the end of the year, I actually had to limit myself, saying I can't write anymore. It's already a 90,000 word book, so that we stop writing. And I had more to write than I could actually fit into the book.
And where is the balance between the grand narrative and the weeds? Because you've got both in the book. You've got the grand narrative, you've got the first principles, you've got the historical antecedents of everything, as it were. And at the same time, you've got specific policy examples with specific things happening, some of which you personally experienced. And how does one balance that? Because there is always a danger of being too abstract at one level, but there is also a danger of getting too much in the weeds and getting too concrete.
So at least, again, I just thought of my audience in mind and what works for them. Is my audience going to really care about the unsubstantiated opinions and hypotheses of a 31-year-old? I don't think so. What I believe the audience that I'm writing for wants to see is, what's in it for me? How does this affect my day-to-day life? Why should I care? And therefore, for me, writing about specific instances that they would have heard of, cultural contexts that resonate with them was very important. which is why I also avoid, for example, talking about things in the 70s and 80s, because most of the audience that I've written this book for were not born then. So I'm writing about things that have happened in the last decade, 2 decades, and how do we capture that. At the same time, I had to link it to the grand narratives, because I think that's what motivates people about this larger notion of contribute, like something that's contributing to nation building. And I was very keen that people see the intersectionality between this. But because, as you rightly said, a lot of people, while they might be socially liberal, are suddenly economically conservative, or whatever, or vice versa. And it's important for people to understand that, as Hayek wrote at the end of the Second World War, that our economic liberties, our political liberties, social liberties are all interlinked, right? And he wrote this in his book, The Road to Serfdom. And I wanted my audience to see this. So therefore, I would say I almost follow the 80-20 principle, where the 80 is the weeds. It is about things people experience in their daily lives. It's their interaction with the police, their interaction with regulators, etc. But at the end of all of it, coming back and saying, guys, why should we care about this? Why is this important? This is not just about changing some law. This is about changing the way we run our government. So I followed, in that sense, the 80-20 principle.
Yeah, and even though, like you spoke about how you didn't use examples from the 70s and 80s because you wanted, people to relate to stuff they'd personally experienced. But firstly, there is some good stuff from the 70s also there, like all the Indira Gandhi period stuff, the emergency. And I'm going to read out those parts later because I think it's important to invoke that the period we're going through is not really unique. It's actually been worse in some ways. And what I also really liked was that sense of going back into history and sort of talking about the path dependence of many of these things, and I'm going to ask you to elaborate on that, especially in the context of, what you call each country's unique leviathan, or why do we have the state that we do, right? And it is not that some random bunch of people got together around a table and said, ki chalo aisa karte hai, but there is a reason the US is the way it is, there's a reason India is the way it is. And, just to set a foundation for the conversation, I'd like you to elaborate on that.
So this is something that people have said for a long time in kind of recent history about path dependency, about how it's difficult to create change once you're on a certain path because there are too many vested interests that build themselves around it, right? We talk about it in the context of, for example, the farm laws and, the whole MSP system, and how now there are too many intermediaries and there's too much path dependency there. As we start kind of peeling the onion back and going further back in time, that's when I started realizing that, hey, look, this path dependency has obviously existed for a very long time. It's probably the circumstances of a country's birth which affect it the most. I go in the book into a lot of the theory behind this, which is, what even is the government, right? The government, at the end of the day, why does a government exist? Why could we not exist without a government? And that's where when we start talking about this model about that Hobbes has kind of written about in his book Leviathan, where he says, in the absence of the government, there's a lot of, in economic terms, what would be called market failures, but there are obviously there are analogies to that in our social and political lives. There would be, especially in a country of India's size, there would obviously be a lot of chaos. We'd probably not have a country of this size. We'd have like villages and a couple of villages being smaller units. The government is essentially an entity to which we give up some of our rights in order to get the security, the order, the benefits, etc., that a government provides. So I think of the government in that sense, that it's a trade-off that citizens make with the entity that is regulating their country, and we give away our rights in order to get order, in order to deal with these market failures. Now, if you go back to the US at the end of the day was born in essentially an anti-tax movement. There was the Boston Tea Party, wherein they kind of obviously protested the tax on that particular commodity. But I think there had been several decades leading up to that moment where there was a power sitting far away that these guys felt exploited by. And they said, look, therefore, we are going to build a constitution, which in that sense is very skeptical of concentration of power. And therefore, the way they set up their entire apparatus is around checks and balances. So we see that they have an executive and a legislature which draw their power independently from the people. which means that, for example, in the last several decades, the presidency and the US Congress have been run by the same party less than 1/3 of the time, which means at any point in time, there is a check on the president's power, which is the legislature. The president of the US might be thought of as the most powerful man on earth, but is actually not, cannot appoint his own cabinet, cannot declare war, cannot declare taxes. So it is actually some list of some 10, 15 powers that a president has. That's what they designed because they were skeptical of the concentration of power. They were skeptical about people's abilities to kind of regulate themselves, which is why they built a constitution which was fairly rigid in that sense. And they were very skeptical or scared of someone kind of corroding that. So they built a constitution which is fairly inflexible, has in even the 250 odd years has been amended very few times. And that was the circumstance of the country's birth, highly devolved, where all the federal pieces have a fair amount of autonomy. And that's the federal architecture that they set up. Whereas you compare that to India, now the context of our birth was that there was social chaos, there was economic stagnation, and therefore the architecture that we built up was an architecture that was designed for the 1940s, for the late 1940s, which was that there was a socialist bent in the way that we thought about things. We created a government which was going to use its interventions in the economy as a way of economic liberation. We had a country, or we had a set of constitution writers who believed that we must use the constitution as a transformative document, that while people have their liberties, those liberties have to be restricted so that we can, for example, deal with untouchability, so that we can deal with property access. So they designed the constitution in such a way that the government had a lot of leeway to be able to deal with the chaos of that time. For example, something like preventive detention. There was a lot of debate in the constitution writing process about that particular clause, but they decided to retain it because they felt that that was required at that point in time. And in fact, Patel comes on the floor and says that, look, it has given me many sleepless nights, but I think this is something that's necessary. So that's what we created for the late 1940s and 1950 in particular. But just that once you have created it and once you've let the genie out of the bottle, no matter what you do, it's going to come back in some form or shape or manner. And the same decisions that were debated and done away with have now crept back into it because of those choices we made. Sedition, which was explicitly debated and explicitly removed from the Constitution, made a backdoor entry through the First Amendment. And we had preventive detention, which has now stayed with us in many forms in many of our laws. So I think that's something that people don't necessarily recognize as much. And part of the writing of this book was to bring forth that path dependency. Obviously, one might argue that then that's an exercise in futility, which means that there cannot be any change that is possible. And which is why I also write that, hey, look, the change is going to come in little bits and pieces. But unless we know this entire context, we might not be able to create that change.
Yeah, wise words. And just to kind of sum up, and I've discussed this theme in many episodes, but to kind of, paraphrase this for my listeners, and you can tell me if I'm doing it right, is that one, we centralized power at that time because when the framers of our constitution were sitting in that room in Delhi, the country was basically falling apart. The country wasn't what it is today. We didn't have all of these states. That process was still going on. Sardar Patel and VP Menon trying to bring everything together. It seemed that the center would not hold. So, therefore, they centralized the power to make sure the center does hold. And they kept many of the powers of the colonial state because those powers helped the colonial state keep all their sort of all the people together, and therefore it seemed to make sense for that reason. So if reason number one is that the center must hold, reason number two was that society must change, because there were so many social evils all around, and it's okay to say that today I can speak in the abstract and say we need complete decentralization, complete local government. But as Ambedkar at that time said, something to the effect of what is a village but a den of localism, ignorance and vice. So I forget his exact words, but to that effect. And therefore it would not have worked. And therefore there is that other impulse that you centralize power, and then you use that power to redesign society from the top down. Even though Ambedkar knew the dangers of that, he called the constitution nothing but a topsoil, and realized the extent of realize what society was really like underneath that. And today, in hindsight, it's really easy for someone like me to look back and say that that project has failed and was always bound to fail, because you cannot do that change from the top down. It has to be from the bottom up, that if we wanted to build a liberal society, it had to come from the bottom up. It could have come from the bottom up. That task is before us. That task is possible. But at that time, it was understandable to think otherwise and to centralize all the power. And when you centralize all the power, we know power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. All these vested interests and build around that. All these bad practices get institutionalized, and we are kind of stuck with it. And Gyan Prakash, in his book on the emergency and in his episode with me, spoke about how the emergency of 1975 was not an aberration. It was not anti-constitutional. The constitution allowed you to do all of those things because it centralized power for a reason. Those reasons might have been understandable. In hindsight, they led us to disaster, and we are stuck in this moment. And it isn't really fair for us, therefore, to sit and look at, to just criticize these decisions in limbo. If you take that entire social and historical context, they made sense at the time, and yet look, here we are.
And I think there are two ways to think about this, Amit. One is that necessarily an either or, right? Top down, bottoms up, this espousal of liberty. I don't think it's either or. In an ideal state, we would have done both. And in fact, when they were writing the constitution, I mean, bottoms up espousal or growth of liberty and those kind of values is going to take time. If you're writing a constitution and you have a 2-year deadline, you have to do something that you can actually achieve within those 2 years, which was to have this top down. I don't think they had any choice, right? They wrote the kind of constitution that in that time made sense. Where we probably went wrong, or where as a country we lost, was we never had a very strong kind of classical liberal political party. And as we were discussing over lunch, that very often the classical liberal political parties or people who espoused all of that came with kind of social conservatism about the kind of princely states and all of that. So somewhere along the lines, we've had the death of a classical liberal alternative in India. So we have 50 shades of left as far as our social and economic policies are concerned. So I don't think it was an either or. I think they made the choice, which was the only choice they could have probably made at that time. But there's somewhere along the way, someone needed to have picked up the mantle of actually making the case for it much stronger. The second point, that the way that I would possibly think about it, is that at the end of the day, as we discussed earlier in this podcast, it's probably a two-way street between formal and informal institutions. And the hope was that as we start putting some of these structures in place, that they would affect the way people lived their everyday lives. And I think that somehow that hypothesis is not played out either. So again, I would encourage all of us to kind of go back to what the book The Narrow Corridor says, right? They made the choices that they had to make in that time period, but the burden of ensuring that we stayed within the narrow corridor stayed with each of the generations to kind of keep chipping away at it.
See, you and I have read The Narrow Corridor, but just for the benefit of my listeners, can you kind of sum up the main thesis of the book?
Yeah, so the main thesis of the book Narrow Corridor is that if you plot, and I'm glad that there is in a very graphical manner, if you plot the capacity of the state on the y-axis and you plot the capacity of the society on the x-axis, then the path to economic prosperity and individual liberties is basically that narrow corridor, which is a line that's originating from the origin and kind of slanting upward. If you have a state that is far more powerful than the society, then you go in the direction of totalitarianism, which is where one might argue China is heading. If you have a society that is far more powerful than the state, then you will have chaos, you will have uncertainties, you'll have kind of smaller communities, you'll have tribalism, etc. It is only when state and society evolve in conjunction, where their capacities increase together, that you really stay within that narrow corridor. The authors of that book argue that India has a more powerful society than it has state, and their argument is primarily around the caste system and other such social limitations. But I think a lot of people might argue, and I do subscribe to that point of view, that in India, in fact, the state is probably more powerful than society because of the way we've written up our laws. And therefore, what we need to do is to get more people involved in these discussions around politics and policies for us to be able to balance that imbalance.
Yeah, I agree with you. And even your fellow Bangalorean Ashwin Mahesh has made this point that the balance between state and society in India is, shifted far too much towards the state. And that too, in an interesting way, that our state really isn't a big state in that sense. Our state is a state that does many things badly, while an ideal state should do a few things really well. And those few things are, the rule of law and national defense and all of those basic things. But we mess up on the basic things, and we do a lot of things badly and act as an impediment to society solving its own problems, which is basically what all market interventions are.
Absolutely. And which is why when I wrote this book, it wasn't necessarily coming only from the point of view of a good, small government or more restricted government is better for rights, etc. A more restricted government is probably just going to be a more effective government. I believe that the Indian state has selectively high capacity. It has ability to do a few very important things really, really well. Unfortunately, the kind of policy making paradigm that we have come to in India is around kind of mission modes. So we have the elections, we run it as a mission mode. We have Swachh Bharat Abhiyan. People debate whether it was useful or not, but it is run in mission mode. So everything that we have done very successfully, polio eradication, etc., has been done in mission mode. So it's only when we put our entire mind space to a particular problem are we able to do a very good job of it. But what determines the kind of lives we live as individuals is what happens when it is not being run as mission mode, when the prime minister is not driving it, when the chief minister is not driving it. Do things still happen? And that's the kind of capacity we need to build, and we will be able to build that capacity only when we start doing fewer things. If the police person, if the constable is too busy filling his diary and reporting on what he did on a day-to-day basis, obviously that person is not going to have time to do a very good job of policing. If we have a judiciary system which is catching people who have consumed alcohol and are filing cases against them, obviously we will have the situation in Bihar wherein the judiciary is suddenly clogged with these kind of cases. It's only when we really cut it down to what is most critical do we start building more state capacity. And in fact, this is what Justice Sri Krishna and Ajay and others have written in their paper about building state capacity. And I think Ajay has written much more about this in his book, which is that because we have limited state capacity outside of these projects, the way we should run it is first take those limited tasks, do them really well, in the process build state capacity, and then start taking on more and more tasks. So therefore, throughout the book, I keep making this point that, guys, this is not just a human rights issue. This is not about just individual liberties. If we really want a country, a state that delivers on the basics, on the everyday requirements of what we want, being corruption free, having good air quality, having good water supply, we need a smaller state that is only going to focus on these things rather than policemen who are going and catching the buffalo of a minister.
Yeah, there's that hilarious story in your book about 7 buffaloes of some important guy get stolen, and hundreds of policemen carry out this mad dragnet and all this shit happening, and you could actually make a large scale cartoon where there are murders and rapes and robberies happening, and policemen are looking for, who stole these 7 buffaloes. And our friend Ruben Abraham also once wrote a piece about a case for limited government based not on ideology or freedom or anything like that, but based on opportunity cost. That if you have limited state capacity, you want it to be put to the right uses. And therefore, you need a limited government because that's the size you have, and you want them to do the right things and not spread out into doing things where they don't need to be. And another point about this mission mode is that often a lot of great tragedies and iniquities get normalized. Like when COVID had happened, I had written a column for Times of India, which I'll link from the show notes, called something like A Tale of Two Disasters, where I said that we are facing 2 disasters. And one is the disaster of COVID, which is an immediate disaster. It's a big deal. We'll fight it. We'll win it. It's a time-bound thing. But the other is a continuing, ongoing disaster of the dysfunctional Indian state. I mean, the fact of the matter is that at that time, the stat I used was that around 3,000 people, 3,000 children die in India every day from starvation. 1 in 4 Indian children are malnourished. If a natural disaster like a hurricane was killing 3,000 children a day, like the freaking world would be jumping to our aid. It would be an incredible crisis. But we've normalized it. The children are dispersed. We don't see them. They're unseen, and we have to make them seen in a sense. And that is, that is one of the tasks before us.
Exactly. And the classic problem of collective action, which is when the tragedies are dispersed, such as this, it becomes very easy to unsee it, right? Even kind of number of children who are dying due to air pollution, and a whole bunch of these issues. I think, as you rightly said, there has to be a different lens to approach some of these problems that we're facing.
So let's go on to talking about what you call India's 3 original sins. And we've, I completely agree with you that at the time, what we are calling sins in hindsight, they're understandable at the time. We totally get that. If we were in their shoes, and we are not as great people as they were, but if we were in their shoes, we would have gone down similar paths. But yet, these are sins, and these are the original sins, and we still kind of suffer from them. So tell me a bit more about this.
So these original sins are what I at least categorize in three categories. The first one, as we've discussed, is this notion of an extremely, extremely centralized state. We see in the years leading up to independence that there are these promises of federalism. There are these promises that, hey, we'll create powerful states. These states will be along certain lines, etc. But just those couple of years before and during partition and independence, when there's so much chaos, I think there's a lot of walking back on a whole bunch of these promises. We spoke earlier about how the governor's office was meant to be directly elected by the people of the state, but that was changed to be a pure representative of the center. We also have Nehru going back on his promises around linguistic states till his hand was forced on the issue. So a lot of these centralizing tendencies of the Indian state come from that time, and they have perpetuated over time. So, for example, in the recent set of fiscal reforms that we have, taxation reforms that we've seen the fiscal autonomy of the states get eroded a lot. And now states have, even despite the GST and all of those other promises that were made to them, now have to rely on a lot of these central kind of transfers from the center. There are a lot of centrally sponsored schemes which are seen to be good things because, hey, you're kind of bringing these programs and helping people. But because these centrally sponsored schemes are now taking away from the fiscal resources of the state, you actually have to now have greater fiscal dependency on the center. So I think we then reached the position where we saw there was a great centralizing tendency in the Indian state, which has increased. And now with the spread of technology and Aadhaar and all of that, we will see that go up. So that's one original sin. The second original sin of the Indian state was to create a somewhat more limited set of fundamental rights. So we see if we compare again with the US fundamental rights don't come with ifs and buts. Each of the Indian fundamental rights probably has like 5 or 6 bullet points under that, some of those specificities, but some of those things, hey, this is not going to apply to this and this is not going to apply to that, and this can be overruled in this case, etc. And while in the US, because it's written in this kind of absolutist fashion, I think courts have by and large upheld those and have said there has to be some very compelling reason, whereas in India, we have that kind of attitude where even judges have come and said, hey, this is like a most abused right and what this is creating problems. So that second thing has been watering down of the fundamental rights of the citizens, which again made sense then, but we are seeing the negative implications of that even today. And the third one is around the economic choices that we made. That we decided that, look, we need to have a government-driven project which will deliver value for our citizens and uplift their lives. We created the 5-year plans. We created the planning commission. We said socialism is going to solve that. We had the industrial policy of 1948 come and nationalize a whole bunch of industries. Over time, that became even more corrosive, whereas this graduated into the license permit Raj, nationalization became far more prevalent, etc. A lot of people might believe that 1991 was a break. But I do not think so. 1991 was a metamorphosis of that system, which moved from a centrally planned economy to a regulatorily planned economy. So it's a little bit like you're driving a car. And I remember when I was learning how to drive a car, I had the steering wheel in my hand, but the brakes and accelerator was still controlled by my father. And it feels a little bit like that, where the government has handed the steering wheels to the private sector, but very often the brakes, the accelerator, the clutch, everything is controlled by the government, which again is not unusual, but the extent to which people believe we have gone on to free markets is actually possibly not true. Our regulators still continue to have a lot of power, and therefore that notion of a centrally planned economy that we have in some form, shape or manner continues to be part of our life. India continues to be one of the most over-regulated economies of the world. And even the way we have set up our regulators is very different from the way that other countries have set up their regulators. In India, regulators such as an RBI, a SEBI, or even kind of TRAI typically have a legislative, an executive, and a judicial arm all fused into one. Whereas regulators in most other countries at least keep the judicial arm out of it. So the way we have structured our regulators also gives them an excessively high degree of power in our lives. So even that economic freedoms that we think we might have received in 1991 is actually not that true. So these are what I call the original sins of the constitution writing process, which we continue to have in our lives today in some form, shape or manner.
Yeah, well said. And I love the metaphor of the car where you have the wheel but not control of the brakes and the clutch, and that expresses it so well. I'd written a piece in, I think, circa 2004 for Wall Street Journal where I'd argued that the 91 liberalization was half baked and incomplete. And of course, I celebrate the 91 liberalization. It got hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. Nitin Pai once estimated that for every 1% growth in GDP, it's something like 2 million people come out of poverty, which is just, a mind-blowing number, and speaks of the moral force of economic growth, all the way down the line. And but so little was done, and we did that. We got complacent. We had 20 great years between 91 to 2011, and then it's kind of not been great. Pooja Mehra had a great book on what went wrong around 2011, and Ajay Shah, etc., have also spoken at great length on this show. And that, let's elaborate a bit on what is the subject of the first chapter in your book. And by the way, I'll just tell everyone, like, of course, all my listeners are going to pick up your book. They better. It's a must read. It's a classic book. And the introduction to me is just brilliant. It's one of the great essays that you should all read. But I'll also talk about the individual chapters. And your first chapter is on economic restraints. And this is a subject I feel strongly about because people think of this as an arcane matter for policy makers. But for me, it's a humanitarian issue because these restraints have huge humanitarian consequences. When some of these restraints come in the form of barriers of entry, which therefore restrict competition, or when they come in the form of tariffs of foreign goods, which therefore keep prices artificially high or quality artificially low, what you're really doing, and I'll link from the show notes to a column I wrote on this, what you're really doing is you're redistributing from the poor to the rich. It is the poor consumers who suffer, it is the rich interest groups who benefit, and every intervention in market, more or less, in my opinion, does exactly this. And and there is one form of thinking that 91 liberalization did a lot. Sure, it did a lot, and thank God it happened, but there's a lot it didn't do. And one of the things it didn't really do is change the pervasive mindset that markets somehow have to be controlled and they're evil and whatever. And people also conflate pro-business and pro-market. And I keep pointing out that it is a freaking opposite. A pro-business policy will help certain cronies, maintain their market share, maybe even become monopolists, and they harm consumers. Whereas pro-market policies will increase the competition, maintain the rule of law, and will benefit consumers, which is consumers is equal to citizens, and therefore is great. So give me a sense of when you, and I have written about this landscape so much for 25 years that my mind just boggles. But writing about it from the vantage point at which you have written about it from, give me a sense of the landscape of economic restraints and the damage that it does.
So, one of the things that, before I even start answering that question, is that when you approach the question of the economy with this idea of liberties, you're very often conflated with some kind of a heartless capitalist who doesn't care about people and is only interested in profit and serving people and too individualistic, etc. I think it's quite the opposite. I think when you start thinking about it while still keeping social welfare as your guiding star, you realize the complexities of the situation. So, for example, if you have high MSPs, sure, it might benefit some farmers, but who is it coming at the cost of? Is it coming at the cost of someone who's in a kind of a rural place and is dependent on buying food grains? Is it coming at the cost of farmers in other regions, etc.? It takes a lot more complexity and ability to deal with it to have these kind of positions. But now coming back specifically to the question that you have, the way I looked at it was, again, taking a very individual-centric viewpoint and saying, look at each of the ways in which we participate as economic agents in the market. We are an agrarian country, for example. Right from seed till the food reaches your plate, there is government intervention at each step of the process. When you think of input markets, for example, the government is controlling the prices of fertilizer, it's controlling land in many ways. So you have inputs to agriculture being controlled. You have procurement from the farm being controlled in many ways, which is the government with the whole MSP system and the APMCs and all of that. And then you finally have the distribution of that food also being controlled by the government in many ways through the PDS system and all that it brings. And in each of these, there is most likely some sort of a price distortion. And every price distortion in the market is basically redistribution from someone to someone else. So when you, for example, distort the price of fertilizer, you are not only redistributing income, but you are also resetting incentives. And you speak about incentives a lot in your show. And if you look at the very micro level of incentives, if I know, for example, that urea is incredibly cheap for me, I'm going to use urea more than I should, which means now I'm leading to nitrogen pollution in my soil, leading to blue babies and everything else that I write in the book. So across each of these areas in the value chain, we have a certain amount of price distortion that is happening, that is leading to second and third order implications. For example, when we are having the PDA system and we are giving people subsidized food grain, but particularly rice and wheat, we're actually incentivizing them to consume a lot more of it than they would have otherwise used out of their own free will. These might all be legitimate choices of state policy. However, the question I ask is not about the outcome, but about the process. That did we consider other alternatives that could have got us to the same point? Did we consider, for example, can we transfer cash to people? Maybe we did. Can we put that document out in public? Can we talk about the pros and cons to make that happen? So in each of these interventions, I'm trying to bring about that kind of question. So that's about the agriculture sector, which is where the most of our population resides. The services sector, which is the growth engine of the economy, I just take two very specific points to kind of make this example, which is that if you look at something like banks, India is so unusual in the fact that there are such large public sector banks. And anyone who's been to a public sector bank and a private sector bank in the same day, and I once did, the difference is so stark that one has to question this. And it's not just about, saying, these public sector guys are lazy, etc. They're still the same human beings, probably getting paid more, which is a good thing. You're able to hire better quality people. But the fact that, for example, the RBI for every private sector bank can go and say that a director of that board should be removed, but cannot do that for public sector banks. So these kind of governance challenges that come in banks is something we don't see in the private sector banks. Similarly, airlines, while we have privatized Air India in recent times, the government was there for a very, very long time, burnt a whole bunch of taxpayer dollars rather than letting the market function, which is why I call these the undefeatables. There's no way that any private player can actually compete against these entities because they're in a way subsidized by the government. And then we look at the manufacturing sector, where India, many claim, has missed the bus in terms of actually building a good manufacturing base. And a lot of them ascribe that to the way that we've built our labor laws. That, for example, once you cross a certain threshold of workers, you now suddenly have to even require government permission to fire those workers. So what you do instead, and this is what I saw firsthand in that factory in Gujarat, is every morning a bus would go to the village, pick up people and bring them to the factory. So which means these guys actually, in effect, because of that law, had absolutely no protection. The day we decided not to send a truck, there's going to be no one who's coming. And for the person who's running that factory, the day there is a party in the village or there is rains and people decide not to show up, he actually has to basically have lower production in their factory. And these are second and third order implications that people don't think about. And again, I reiterate, there are very good reasons to do this, and nobody's coming at these with bad intentions. They want people to have food on the plate. They want farmers to not be as vulnerable as they are. The question is, are we actually thinking about the second and third order implications? Are we thinking about what are the alternatives for us to achieve the same policy impact? And finally, I dedicated an entire chapter to talking about regulators, because while a member of parliament looks at some 50 to 60 laws, regulators are bringing out far more than that. And these are the invisible parts of our economy that are not just our economy. Now we have regulators in competition, we have regulators in content moderation, etc. These are the invisible arms of the state that people probably don't see and think about as much, but these are controlling the day-to-day of how each of our businesses works. So again, the landscape is fairly large, it's fairly complex, but the common thread through all of that is a government that has made certain choices, and we as a nation have not had enough debate about how each of those choices actually play out.
And I think a fundamental mistake many people when they think about public policy is that they conflate intention for outcome. So they assume that if a policy has a good intention, it's great. So a government can get away with just focusing on intention because it makes for a good narrative and not really thinking about outcome per se. And the point I keep making about how these labor laws have actually hurt workers more than helped them is, beautifully brought out by this illustration. And I want to give a couple of illustrations from agriculture because they really speak to me. And the first is Delhi pollution, right? The Delhi pollution happens because farmers in Punjab are burning the leftover of the rice at the end of the season because they have no way to get rid of it. Now, Punjab is an arid state. Why the hell are they growing rice, which is a water intensive crop? Because there were MSPs set on rice, incentivizing them to grow rice, and therefore they get bore wells and tube wells and whatever to draw out water from deep under the earth. So you're also messing up, our sort of water supplies or, the water balance of the region by doing all of that and by using all of this machinery. And then you're kind of making rice because of these incentives. And all of these laws, and no one could have thought of this, like a fourth order effect, that you're causing pollution in Delhi by giving an MSP on rice, which is mind blowing.
And also, I think there's a question of equity, right? Many people might argue, hey, why you think about the farmers, poor farmers' rights versus someone sitting in Delhi, but you also think about a farmer in Punjab versus the rights of a farmer in West Bengal. If it's a rice growing region, why is the procurement of rice from West Bengal so little? Because we haven't built out the infrastructure to procure rice from there, and therefore again path dependency. We started procuring from Punjab, Haryana, Madhya Pradesh, and we've now continued procuring the bulk of our rice from there. And I think at some level, people will have to stop thinking of this as some sort of heartless urban elitist complaint against farmers, but as a fundamental question of equity, which is why are we discriminating between a farmer in Punjab versus a farmer in Bengal?
There's a fantastic nuance. And the other illustration is of APMCs. Now, APMCs are marketplaces which are set up with a very laudable intention that you want farmers to have a guaranteed place where they can go and sell where nobody will cheat them. And, want retailers and consumers to have a guaranteed place where they can go and buy. But because it's a monopoly, you have you have no bargaining power on either side. The APMC has all the power. And therefore, a farmer will often go there and say, sell something for 2 rupees, which the consumer buys for 18 rupees. Whereas if there was a competitive marketplace, the farmer could have sold for 10 rupees, the consumer could have brought for 12 rupees. Both of them benefit, by a substantial amount. And when I did an episode with Gunwant Patil, who's a Shetkari Sangatana leader, he told me about this great poem by Sharad Joshi ji, who sadly, is dead. Otherwise, I would really have loved to have him on the show, a great leader. And I'll just read this out and then I'll translate it. And this is about the APMC. And this is a farmer speaking, where he says, Marte hum bhi hai, marte tum bhi ho. This is a farmer speaking to the consumer. Marte hum bhi hai, marte tum bhi ho. Hum sasta bech ke marte hai, tum mehenga khareed ke marte ho. And the way I've translated this is thus: I die, my friend, and so do you. I die, my friend, and so do you. I sell my produce cheap and die. You pay so much that you die too. So the government, this intervention, creating a negative sum game. And by the way, one of the things that the farm laws were doing were bringing competition in and saying, yeah, APMCs will still be there, but they will no longer have a monopoly. And it would have benefited both consumers and farmers. But you have, like you said, part dependency, vested interests, and blah, blah, blah. And today's politics is oppose everything any government does, even if once in a while they... Anyway, Ajay Shah and I have had an episode on the farm laws, so I can kind of link that. So, next, let's talk about another aspect of the state. And I'm skipping through different parts of your book. You'll excuse me, I'm not following your order. I'm kind of picking the ones which speak to me with most emotive force. And this chapter of yours is the 4th chapter. It's called His Master's Police. And you point out how, number one, the police structure that we have is, just taken from the British, from the colonialists. So the objective of it is not to protect the rights of the people, but to subjugate them. It's absolutely the opposite, which is important to note. And you write, quote, even former police officials argue that the unquestioned loyalty to the imperialists has merely been replaced by complete submission to the political interests of the ruling party. And later, you speak about the emergency, which is useful to talk about police excesses and also to remind people today that, that there is a fundamental problem with the state and not necessarily with any one party. And you have this great story about how on March 1, 1976, a student of an engineering college in Calicut called Rajan Warrior was picked up. And he was tortured. And for years, they didn't know what the hell happened. They rolled a wooden log over his body. They just knew he was tortured. And then eventually, after the emergency was lifted, years later, the father of the kid filed a petition with the High Court of Kerala, and his body couldn't be located. And actually, what had happened is that his body had been fed to pigs. Right? Somebody's body fed to pigs. Remarkable. And then an entire paragraph that I want to quote, the police arrested nearly 110,806 people during the emergency under preventive detention laws, even though they had not committed a crime. This included at least 30 MPs as well. They tortured or killed many of the detainees. For example, they arrested Kannada film actress Snehalata Reddy for an alleged plot to smuggle dynamite into the country to blow up railway stations. However, she was not even named in the final charge sheet filed by the police. Despite having chronic asthma, she was regularly tortured in police custody. Her prison mates later recounted hearing her screams in the middle of the night. On 2 occasions, she even went into an asthmatic coma. The police kept her in jail for 8 months till her failing health forced them to release her on parole. She died of a lung infection merely 5 days after she was released. Stop quote. And there's a great book on the emergency by Kumi Kapoor. I've had an episode with Kumi ji where she really speaks about all this, and we need to read that to understand the, in a sense, a part dependence of the Indian state which brought us here. And what you importantly also point out is that we didn't course correct after this. That after the emergency, the new government, created a national police commission, suggests ways to reform this. Not a thing was done, right? And so give me a sense of how deeply dangerous a problem this is, because there is a paradox here that if the police exists not to protect the rights of the people, but to protect the interests of those in power if they are directly under the politicians, and the only people who can reform the system are the politicians themselves, then aren't we stuck with this?
So I started off, when I'm writing this book, thinking about how do people experience government in their everyday lives. And the most visible form in which we experience government is the police. Because while we're walking on the road, there is a certain notional belief that if something happens to me, the police is going to come there and be protecting of me and generally hold law and order together. As you read some of those passages and stories from the emergency that I write in my book, I don't think enough young people know about it. And as I read some of these, and especially as I, for example, read Rajan Warrior's father's poem, and he's also written a book about it, it really brings it alive in a very visceral way that this is the extent to which the Indian state can go, and very often in a way that doesn't punish people who are actually responsible for that. So a lot of these excesses in Delhi, for example, happened under a certain police officer, which as soon as the Congress government returned, was then promoted to positions of power. So the perpetrator was in a way almost rewarded for what he'd perpetrated. Now, here's talking about the police in particular. One of the lenses that I took was we have to start with a position of empathy for that individual police officer. At the end of the day, they have very, very poor working conditions. Some of them are working 14, 15 hours a day. They have relatively low training. They have relatively low wages. Only about less than 5% have actually been trained in the last several years. So we are not investing in their training. In some states, as we only have about 20 to 30% of the weaponry that the police requires. So we are talking about a police force which is under-resourced, which is understaffed, which is under-trained, which is under-invested in. Therefore, when we are talking about police reforms, we should not really actually be thinking about the police officer on the street, but we should be talking about the systems and processes. The systems and processes, as you rightly said, are British systems and processes. The Police Act is an 1861 act. It was constituted right after the War of Independence, when they realized, look, the army can't be doing all of this, so we need to create a police. The purpose of this police is to control the people. Those design choices continue to affect how we experience our police in our everyday lives. As we discussed previously on the show, that the police reports to the Home Minister who's sitting in a distant land. Compare that to the UK, for example, where the local elected representatives have a lot of say in how the police functions, holds them accountable, etc. In India, there's a very distant power which holds them accountable. Even the question of accountability in the police, for example, if you have in the US a complaint against the police, you can actually go to a complaint board which consists majority of civilians, and that is going to do police investigations, and in many cases I actually recommend termination. That kind of transparency, that kind of accountability doesn't exist out here. If something happens, typically it is the government deciding to suspend or transfer or whatever else. So those tools of accountability also lie in the hands of the very same entity which effectively is being held accountable. So there's something very deeply flawed in that system. Throughout the centuries, we have actually had people come and say this system doesn't work. 1902, the British themselves, one of their committees came and said this is an oppressive system, this is a corrupt system, it doesn't work. And yet at the same time, obviously the British had no incentive to change the system. Then we had the emergency. Government that came after it realized that this is the problem that's going to create, and we actually had a lot of we had the National Police Commission, which brought out report after report, which spoke a lot about how the police can be reformed. But despite the fact that since then we've probably not had a single majority Congress government for very long, we've still not been able to implement that. So the very same people who suffered under the emergency did not have the political will to implement it. Then the Supreme Court also, in response to a petition filed by a former top cop of the police, came out with recommendations, and there's been recent study which says almost no state has implemented all of those recommendations. So these are things almost that we've known since time immemorial and hasn't happened. And as we rightly say, that it is because the people who can change it are exactly the people who benefit from the current system. That if you have control of the police, you have a lot of political and social power. Therefore, I think the only way out of this is to have a wider societal conversation about this, which is if people realize that, hey, look, there is an alternative way of setting up police, there's an alternative way of having accountability mechanism, perhaps enough of us will speak about it for the government to gradually give up a little bit of their power in favor of the people to actually have greater accountability from their police. So I think this is going to be a fairly long journey, and it is really encouraging, most importantly, that former police officials themselves are speaking up about this. And I'm also hopeful that one can perhaps build an agenda around this which talks about improving the quality of life of police personnel at the same time as improving these structures, because it is only when we have this kind of a very top-down hierarchical system that is ending up with the Home Minister of a state that we also have a system wherein the vast majority of the police personnel actually have very little career progression to look forward to. They cannot climb to the top of the ranks, that they have to be subservient to their seniors. In fact, in the Police Act, of the duties of what is listed on the policeman, one of the top ones is to follow orders. And so they are also part of this system of subservience. They have to fill out registers after register, too much documentation, which is never ever going to be used. And hopefully we can once build a combined agenda that looks at both of these in conjunction and therefore builds the political will. So I think it is incumbent on people who are trying to make change in this to actually be able to build that platform.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that you pointed out that we have to have empathy for the individual policeman, because the fact of the matter is we're all humans responding to incentives, and what is more, we are all broken and fucked up people inside, right? And if we are in a broken and fucked up system, good things cannot possibly come out of that. So, and that empathy is really difficult because you're out there and your traffic police is hassling you and you're getting late to go somewhere and you're like, why doesn't the police go and stop crimes? Why are you doing petty rent seeking? But that's a freaking system. That's not the guy. There but for the grace of the flying spaghetti monster go I, right? I mean, I could be in that person's shoes. And it's, so that's sort of an important point to remember. We've already spoken about free speech, but let's talk about it again. In the fact that one, you've pointed out that even within the Constitution, with the First Amendment, Article 19, you have Article 19B, is it? Which has all the caveats to it, like public order, decency, all of that, which can be interpreted so widely that, literally anyone can go to jail at any point because you can just, anyone can kind of take offense. We still have laws like 295A and 253A and all of those, which essentially make free speech impossible in India. Like I often say that, with all our bad laws, thank God that in many areas state capacity is so low. Otherwise we'd be completely screwed. When you have so many bad laws, you want state capacity to be low so they can't implement, and you want there to be corruption, so there is a way to reduce the friction within the system that the laws otherwise create. But that's a separate point. Let's talk about where the state of free speech is, especially in modern times, because one of the things that you have pointed out correctly is that you know that the laws may or may not be used is sort of, how much the laws are used don't really matter, because one, the process is a punishment. It doesn't matter how many convictions you actually get. The process is crazy. People have been in jail for 25 years and etc. And you've given examples in the book. And two, it has a chilling effect where everybody is just going to think that why the hell should I bother? Wire, as you point out, raised 30 crores in 5 years, and they have cases against them for 100 crores, 200 crores, whatever the hell. Jay Shah filed a 100 crore case, I think. And that creates a chilling effect where even if the government doesn't own the media will still draw boundaries of how far they can go. Netflix will still say कि कोई political show नहीं करना है, आपका show cancel. All this shit still happens. And at the same time, there is a countervailing force where technology is enabling people to speak out in various different ways. You and I can have this conversation, and perhaps because we fly under the radar and we are not important enough. But, so how do these play out? That on the one hand, you have the state with its repressive laws, especially when it comes to free speech, which really does not exist in India, and it's no party's fault. It's always been this way. And on the other hand, you have technological tools which almost allow people like us to live in a sense outside the domain of the state, where we can say what we want, we can create what we want, we can use a VPN, and we can, go somewhere and have conversations and post content. So when you look at the state of free speech in India, what do you think, especially when, like in the, opposition leaders really haven't been arrested in the numbers that happened during the emergency. During the emergency, I think I would certainly be in jail. I don't know about you. I think you've been under the radar. You're an important corporate person. But me and most of my friends would be in prison. It's easy for these guys to do that the moment they want. And as a mutual friend of ours, I won't named, once said, and we'll talk about surveillance later, but I met him in this 5-star hotel, and the first thing he said to me was, Amit, switch off your phone. And I had to switch off my phone, and only then would he speak to me, right? And I'm sure you can guess who it is. And one of the things that he said was that his surmise is that so far it's fine. These guys have been winning elections, right? They're winning elections fair and square. You assume that that is the case. They don't need to hack electoral machines because they've hacked minds. But if they find that they're losing an election, they can't possibly afford to lose it, because they will all land up in jail because of all the vindictive acts that they have carried out. So they have no option. If they win the election, that's great. If they don't win the election, they'll cancel the election and they'll do what they can to stay in power. And if we reach that worst case scenario, all your free speech goes for a toss. Everything goes for a toss. So what's sort of your thinking on this?
That's a great question, because there is a certain amount of paradox here, which is obviously we are having this conversation and we are having it fairly openly, and other people are also having these conversations, and perhaps it's a reflection of how inconsequential you are, but I at least like to think of it a little bit more positively, saying that, look, at the end of the day, we do have a significant degree of freedom of speech, because the same conversation that we are having in many countries, especially in our neighborhood, etc., would be totally cannot happen, right? There'd be consequences to that. And once again, I think we see this phenomenon of the apparatus of the state leaving potential open, so for the government to be selectively sensitive to some of these things. And especially in recent times, I think as polarization has increased, for the government to do the bidding of a very vocal minority in trying to restrict certain people's free speech. So even especially when you talk about art and literature, a lot of this free speech violations we've seen has been in response to some sort of grievances by people, right? So someone saying that, look, Bharat Mata should not be like this in a painting, or the Queen should not have her waist shown, or, this is a wrong representation of the Islamic community, etc. So the government, I think, has the ability to respond. Whether it chooses or not to respond remains to the particular government, including this one, previous one, etc. The question I kind of ask in the book is, why should that decision be left to governments. Governments, at the end of the day, are representatives of the majoritarian will of the country. And free speech is, because it's a human right, is something that is very deeply enmeshed with minority rights. And there is therefore that fundamental disequilibrium. So when I think about the free speech problem in India, as I put it, it's not so much this particular government or that particular government, but the question is, the only forum in which speech related issues or balancing of human rights needs to be done is the judiciary. The government is not the right forum to do that. A bureaucrat is not trained how to balance one right against the other or one objective against the other. It's not a system. It's not a forum designed to do that. There is no counter questioning. There's no presentation of argument. Decisions are taken far quicker than they're in the judiciary. So I think India's structural problem as far as free speech is concerned is the lack of judicial oversight at the beginning. We have judicial oversight at the end, which is you arrest someone, they are in the jails, and depending on how fast they can get to the court, it determines how quickly they get free. And obviously, many people cannot fight that battle, and that is what has the chilling effect. If we flipped the order and we said, look, every time that you have to clamp down on someone's free speech, including covering the waist of that queen on the celluloid, you need a court warrant to be able to do that. And many people might argue that, look, we don't have enough capacity in the courts and all of that, but it's still a net positive over where we are. So I think of that as the fundamental problem of free speech in India. While doing research for this book, one of the things that really struck me was, from a free speech perspective, are we actually freer or less free compared to the British times? And I think Abhinav Chandrachud makes this argument in his book that in many cases we are actually not as free as we were under British time. So when the sedition was invoked against Bal Gangadhar Tilak, they needed a warrant before going and arresting him. Whereas when Kanhaiya Kumar faced the same situation, you don't need a warrant anymore. In the 1970s, the requirement for a warrant was done away with. So there is those kind of things. Then we have something around morality. The British didn't care whether people were kissing on screen. They didn't care about those issues because obviously they were not involved with the community. But now, because we have governments which are democratically elected, they have to respond to the wishes of these communities, even if they're really small groups, which means that in many ways the bar on morality, quote unquote morality, has now increased. That we have free speech incursions happening because of the morality of a certain community's outrage a lot more than it would have happened previously. So for me, while doing research for this book and while speaking to people and reading, that was something that came across as a fairly new thing for me. Now, to your question of where are we headed, as you rightly said, then now we have the technological tools to be able to circumvent a whole bunch of this very easily. Again, an example I quote in the book is that if the government wanted during the emergencies to stop it, they just pulled power from all the printing presses. Nobody could go to press. You cannot do that anymore unless you shut down the entire internet. And that is a much higher cost than just pulling power from electricity presses. Therefore, I think the battleground around free speech is now going to shift to cyberspace, which is why we see this whole battle around the WhatsApp encryption case, which is, should WhatsApp be end-to-end encrypted? Because if it is end-to-end encrypted, then nobody else, including the government, can actually see what I'm talking about to my friends. They can only see metadata. They can see that I sent you a text sometime yesterday, but they can't see what I said. I could have been talking about coffee, or I could have been talking about very seditious stuff. And I think that's where the battleground is going to shift. And to be fair, every government is fighting that battle. The UK, in the garb of child safety, is also trying to in some way undermine end-to-end encryption. So I think the freedom of speech and the freedom to say what we say and believe what we believe is now going to be played out in cyberspace. I think therefore it's really important for people to engage in those kind of issues. I think our speech is going to be determined by whether end-to-end encryption stays. It's going to be determined by how much any government can actually coerce social media platforms to give up data. It's going to depend on our ability as an international community to come up with rules, because at the end of the day, even the people who espouse free speech don't espouse absolutely free speech, right? Even they are saying there should be no hate speech. So obviously these are even conceptually really difficult things to grapple with. And I think the emergence of a set of global standards around this is going to be something that's going to determine how we as everyday Indians experience it.
So I want to double click on on a couple of aspects of this. And one of those is the judiciary, where you're saying get the judiciary into the process earlier. Like in Bal Gangadhar Tilak's case, the British had to actually produce a warrant first. If every time you have to go to a judge with some frivolous nonsense about so-and-so's waist is uncovered, then you nip a lot of these in the bud. But my question, and it's a larger question, and it also, speaks to this hope that many people have that the judiciary will save us, is what if the judiciary is also co-opted? And it is certainly partly co-opted at least, but what if the judiciary is also co-opted because the government has the tools to do that? They have the carrots in terms of post-retirement sinecures and even plain up cash, and they have the sticks, and we've seen that with Justice Lawyer. So, and I don't in fact understand the way the system is structured, how we can even expect the judiciary to be independent. If it is so far, or if parts of it are independent so far, I think we are just lucky with the individuals out there and the way that they're behaving. But, what are your thoughts?
So firstly, I think it's a far more complex topic than just saying judicial independence, because independent from whom? In a democracy, nothing is supposed to be independent. So even if there is complete independence of the judiciary, that's probably a problem. Independence and accountability are two things that have to come hand in hand. But that said, right, saying that's a complex issue, the way I would approach designing democratic institutions bottoms up is to say there has to be horizontal and vertical distribution of power. As long as there's a judiciary which has reasonable independence and it is battling with government which also has reasonable independence and power, I think that's a good thing for democracy, that these distribution of power, that there isn't concentration of power. Now, to have that distribution of power, what becomes really important is to have this kind of independence that we spoke about. And that's where we go to the crux of the matter, which is around some of these rules, some of these norms that have to be put in place. Now, let's take examples. If you come to think of it, the government, when in the 1990s, till the 1990s, we had a single election commissioner. At that point, the government brought in 2 election commissioners in addition to the chief election commission, where the chief election commission can only be removed by a 2/3 majority of parliament. The other election commissioners can just be removed by government on their own. So we have to think about these kind of problems which make institutions less independent and start plugging them one by one. At this point, for example, even as you talk about the ordinance case in Delhi, many might argue that actually having a committee which decides on transfers of bureaucrats is actually probably a good thing, because it protects the bureaucrats from the vagaries of even the state government. But then that body has to be somewhat independent of other political powers in the vicinity. And because this body that has been proposed in the ordinance has 2 bureaucrats appointed by the centre, so obviously it doesn't have that level of independence. So we have to keep pushing for that. And if we see again the way things have evolved in the country, I think in many places these have started to be put in place. There have been instances where the Supreme Court has stepped in and saying the CBI director must be appointed in this case. So if we now have the CBI director is appointed by a committee which has the leader of opposition, Prime Minister, and the Chief Justice of India. So one can at least say the appointment is somewhat insulated, maybe not downstream. So these structures have to be put in place. But even if these structures are put in place, we know that there are enough loopholes that even with this kind of setup of the CBI director's appointment, we still know that there are allegations of influence. And that's where I think some societal norms have to build out around that, wherein society has to come and step up and say, look, this is not unacceptable. And we have good examples of that in Israel, right, where people have come onto the streets and saying, look, we need to protect the autonomy of the Supreme Court. And I think as people talk about institutional independence a lot more, I think that's how we'll get there. And again, I would like to take us back to the fact that this is not unique to this government. It happens at the state level, where it probably flies under the radar because there are too many to keep track of. And it's happened previously as well. But if I have to summarize them, then A, the interplay between accountability and independence is complex. B, we need distribution of power. We just have to prevent the concentration of power in any one entity. Thirdly, that there's a lot that we can improve just by the nuts and bolts of how appointments are done, how salaries are decided, can you be appointed to political office after or not? And finally, at the end of the day, it'll all boil down to the culture and people actually talking about these issues.
Marvelous. Now, the other point I want to double click on is you spoke about the WhatsApp encryption battles and how states everywhere are fighting with, to get more and more control of information and surveillance and all that. And you have a couple of lines in your chapter on that. The chapter is called the Panopticon, and your lines are, quote, every government has a legitimate need to carry out surveillance to protect its citizens from terrorists and to catch criminals. However, this need should be balanced against individual liberties. As an analogy, just because some people stash black money in lockers governments cannot have a key to every locker in the country. Stop quote. And here, the classic trade-off is between the state saying that, listen, part of what the state is there to do is to keep you safe and to protect your rights, and therefore this is important. And the tech companies, in a sense, are caught between a rock and a hard place. If they don't comply with it is logical that every company should comply with the laws of the country in which it is operating. If the laws are like this, why blame the company? So I'd be inclined to think that this is really a battle between state and society. And so give me a sense of what's happening here and the larger question. Like, you've also given examples from how China is moving towards dystopia, about how they have what are called nanny apps for the Uyghurs, where that certain proportion of the population which is Muslim, they have to carry apps on their phones which is tracking their location and transmitting it at all times to the authorities and taking various other data about them, like blood glucose and whatever, just capturing all of that. And it's like an extreme invasion of privacy. It's as if the people belong to the state, and not the other way around, where really the way to think about it is of the state as an instrument of the people. So what is sort of your sense of this? Because on the one hand, we speak about how technology can empower individuals and we can break free in various ways. But on the other hand, there is a race against the state, which is fighting its own irrelevance, perhaps, by using this technology at scale to control his citizens and to know everything about them. And who knows, maybe the first listener of this conversation will be some bureaucrat in some surveillance office. Amit Verma ka naya podcast aaya long before it is released, who knows. But what are your thoughts on this balance or this race and so on?
So let's start with the fact that this is not something that's new. Has been happening for a long time. And again, I was not born in that year, but people tell me that when the 1984 riots, for example, broke out, you already had access to the voters list, which had people's addresses, that you can actually very systematically go about persecuting people just based on that. I think what technology does is to make it extremely easy. Today, for example, if someone has to listen to Amit Verma's latest podcast before it is released, someone probably manually has to sit through and listen through the 3, 4, 5, 7 hours. And maybe they don't have the attention span for that. But someday it's probably going to be replaced by AI, which is going to be able to pick up on some keywords and then zoom in on that part of the conversation and understand that. So surveillance always existed, now incredibly easy because of technology, and will become even massively easier. So it's going to become almost like war machines that are deployed in everyday life. So it's like we're walking with a policeman right next to us all the time. Now, as I rightly say, that state needs to do surveillance in order to protect us. At the end of the day, we live in a region particularly that makes us very vulnerable as a country. We also have a large population, state capacity is limited, resources are limited, policemen need these kind of support to be able to do their job very well. But we are going down a very slippery slope, and it's almost an inevitable slope, but we are going down that slippery slope wherein, for example, even Justice Sri Krishna, who wrote the first draft of India's privacy law, when he saw some of the later drafts, he said this is taking us in the direction of an Orwellian state, wherein we might actually have surveillance and restrictions with us all the time. Here's how I would approach the problem. I think if we make the case to Indians that, hey, this is the extent of surveillance I need to do on you to keep you safe, I think a lot of us will be open to that, because a lot of people are rational people. They understand, look, we live in a neighborhood which necessitates this kind of surveillance, etc. So making the case that this is how we decide what is the appropriate level of surveillance. But more importantly, once we have decided that this is what we are going to do, then show us evidence that you are actually doing that. So while phone tapping is obviously a perfectly legitimate state aim and the state instrument, but how many of these phone taps have actually been produced as evidence in courts? What's the data around that? Right? And I think that's the transparency we need to be able to create to unpack this black box. I think the problem with surveillance we have right now is it's a black box. In the 1990s, the Supreme Court came in and said, you can't just surveil anyone's phone. You need to have an order by a Home Secretary. You need to have a review committee. Do we know when the review committee meets? Do we know how many applications are filed? Do we even have basic data on how many get approved, how many don't get approved? In the mid-2010s, someone filed an RTI query. Just tell me how many of these requests went to the review committee and how many got approved. No specific details. And that RTI response got denied. So I think it is a very fine balance that we have to strike. And as a country, as a society, we cannot strike that balance unless we have people questioning that data. So I think there is therefore requirement for some sort of, for a lot more transparency, and to use a very hackneyed term, for almost independent regulators to be able to step in and see if the government is holding this balance or not.
Yeah, I mean, again, independent regulators, independence, accountability, all of it gets so messy. One of the larger themes which you've spoken about, and the parts of your writing which I really enjoy are where you speak about, where you kind of take a step back and build a larger frame through which we can look at everything. And in one of those, you spoke about the three mega trends that are shaping our institutions. Now, on the one hand, it's true that these institutions have been with us forever. Some of them have been with us since 1947 or 1950. Some have been with us since colonial times, and stretching back to more than 100 years before that. But at the same time, there are three sort of mega trends you've identified which are affecting it in fundamental ways, and perhaps creating unknown unknowns also, so one can't really sit and forecast too much. But you've looked at how you've in a sense looked at how some of them are strengthening our institutions, some could be eroding our institutions. So just kind of take me through that.
So the basic premise of this part of my book is that the same country, the same set of people in the same situation can react in very different ways based on how their institutions and their politics evolves. And the example I quote in the book is in the interwar period, where the Scandinavian countries and Germany found themselves in a very similar situation. In fact, many countries did, which was social unrest, economic breakdowns, etc. And the approach that Scandinavian countries in general followed was one of forming alliances, finding the middle ground, building camps, etc. Whereas Germany followed a far more exclusionary, almost battle lines drawn out, one institution going after the other. What I'm trying to say in this chapter is, because of these three megatrends, we are entering an age of much, much greater uncertainty. What are these three megatrends? A, there's the spread of technology. So on one hand, it strengthens institutions because we can have this conversation on this podcast and people can listen to it. We can organize politically far more easier. But at the same time, it's far more easier for the government to be able to surveil us. So the spread of technology both strengthens and weakens institution. There is a trend around identity and polarization, which is because now people are far more aware of their identities, etc. They're able to express it far more easily, but it's also leading to a lot of polarization in society. So even if you take something like caste, it has become far more democratic because people are speaking up and expressing it, but at the same time, it's also leading to intercaste violence, etc., which has shot up because of social media. And the third mega trend that I speak about is that while immediately after independence, we had this majority government in all states and at the center, right now, there is some level of distribution. For example, we saw in the farm laws that even the majority government, which had a brute force majority, was forced to roll them back. We have seen that in the labor laws that were brought out previously by this government. So clearly, this government, despite its majority, doesn't have the same powers as the post-independence Congress government did. It needs to balance with international allies, state governments, MNCs. If you do something that's really wonky for the economy, there's going to be flight of capital and there's a lot of economic consequences. So these three are the megatrends: the spread of technology, identity and polarization, and the distribution of power. Each of these can move institutions, strengthen institutions, or weaken institutions. The direction that they take will be dependent on the path that we adopt. So, for example, one way that the distribution of power can take is in increasing confrontation, which is you start creating these narratives of this is the enemy, this foreign power is the enemy, I am the government here to protect you, I'm going to confront them, and I confront them at many political fora. Or you can say, look, you have different priorities, I have different priorities, let's find the middle ground, etc. So our ability as a country and as a society to nudge and keep nudging institutions in the direction of strengthening them will essentially be the determinant of how these institutions evolve.
So, there's tons in your book that I want to talk about, but everybody is, no doubt, every listener should go out and buy them. You've spoken about, the interplay between the state and the interference in culture. You've got a great chapter on regulation. You've got a chapter called Peering into the Crystal Ball, about looking into the future. And I'll, instead of going into the weeds in each of them, I'll just ask listeners to kind of pick them out. But what I do want to ask you about is about change, because a lot of your book is really descriptive and talks about all the things that are wrong, and everyone must read it, because a lot of this is like TIL stuff. People don't know enough about it. But you have also spoken about the path ahead and the ways in which institutions can evolve and change. And you've spoken in particular about 4 channels of institutional evolution, two of which are soft guardrails, two of which are hard guardrails. And I want you to sort of elaborate on each of those, and tell me what they are, and how potent do you think they might be in bringing about change?
So the motivation behind this chapter was, a lot of people, I think, when they look at other people who are talking about things, they're like, hey, you're an armchair activist, just sit down, you don't know anything, etc. And the purpose of this chapter is also to attack this idea that armchair activists don't matter, because unfortunately in a democracy, or fortunately in a democracy, armchair activists also matter. The voice that each one of us express really matters, and we've seen it very recently in the whole fiasco related to the tax collected at source and international credit cards, that there's such a Twitter storm that the government was forced to roll back all of that. So I think that's where I started writing about these soft guardrails are things which armchair activists can do. One is that I think in any democracy, the government is sensitive to the voice of the people. And we again see that example most potently in the way we conduct our elections. The model code of conduct, if you think of it, actually has very flimsy legal grounds. If the government or if anyone wants to challenge it, it would make for a very compelling case. But it holds fort because it has become what one of the chief election commissioners I spoke to said, it's become a moral code of conduct. That there's a great moral value that is attached to it. So as people speak about some of these things, change happens. The second soft guardrail is that now people internationally can vote with their wallets. So in case, for example, the government brings in an economic policy which is really disliked by people, there's going to be flight of capital from the country. If we have inflation that is not controlled and stable, there's going to be flight of capital from the country. And that has a lot of downstream implications which harm the people who are in the political position. So these are the 2 soft guardrails, which is 1, speaking with your voice, and B, speaking with your wallet. The hard guardrails are the more obvious ones, which is actually going and showing up for a political protest or any kind of political mobilization. We've seen that with RTI, with Anna Hazare, etc. Many people think that those are for very issue-specific things, but I do think if you look at all of these, they were in some form, shape, or manner talking about institutional change. Even the farm laws, one of their demands was that there should be a law backing the MSP, so that is talking about some sort of an institutional change. And finally, a lot of the changes that happen in the Indian ecosystem has been because of courts. So that's why I call them the courts of change. And out there, we've seen from anything ranging from the right to privacy, decriminalization of homosexuality in recent years, back to the question you had initially posed about the constitution and the ability to change it. And then we go to the case of Nanda Bharti case as well, wherein the basic structure doctrine was put in place. So we see the courts step in from time to time to protect the institutional architecture of the country. So these are the 4 things that I call the 4 channels of change. And I think it's very important for people and readers to be aware of this, because otherwise you can give in to the pessimism of believing that nothing is ever going to change. But it's only by looking at this that you actually realize that even as an armchair activist, even as a Twitter activist, there is some role that you can play in actually changing the state of the country, even on such relatively technical issues as institutions.
So my third last question, as you can see, I'm organized. My third last question is that, and this is a question I think I've also asked you, and we had a brief discussion on it when you gave a presentation on your book at Ajay and Susan's office a while back. And it's this, that on the one hand, we can see how tectonic events at a particular point in time lead to part dependence in a way that continues for decades, perhaps because of inertia, perhaps because of interests arising that protect that way of being. So whether it is the sort of American independence, which led to that kind of government, which paid a premium on personal liberty, and that became then a cultural quality, which the people still fight for and stand for, though I would say that in many ways they've eroded their freedoms, but they still have way more of them than we do. And similarly, we set upon a particular path with a really centralized government and a particular economic system in 1947, which has been really, really hard to change and even seems impossible to change. Now, I understand that incremental change at the margins can have a massive humanitarian impact just because of the scale. You're talking the most populous country in the world, and the scale is so much that even a tiny change can make a big impact. However, the fundamental edifice remains the same fundamental edifice. And therefore, the question must come that, tectonic events are not over in the world. It is not as if the world, in a teleological sense, the world was designed to arrive here and now we will be like this forever. One way in which it could come, for example, is delimitation. When, I had an episode on North versus South with R.S. Neelakantan, and he elaborated on many of the things you speak about how states have lost so much power because, of the center, and especially evocative in a North versus South sense. So, will it really, to change the fundamental edifice from which we suffer so much, to reverse the original sins which you talk about, can that happen through incremental change, or does it really require something more tectonic than that, whatever that thing might be? We are in a space of unknown unknowns.
So I'll start with two prefaces to my answer. One is, as you rightly said, I think it's naive to assume that tectonic shifts are never going to happen. It's the end of history in any way. Sri Lanka, Pakistan, etc. We're seeing there's enough that's kind of reaching that boiling point in our neighborhood for that tectonic shift to happen. Sometimes tectonic shifts happen and then reverse, like we've seen in Myanmar. So obviously, it's not the end of history. Tectonic shifts can happen. One of the things Indira Gandhi said about India is that it's more difficult for these tectonic shifts to happen just because of the size of and diversity of the country. But even in a country of our size, can possibly happen. The second thing is that while I do talk about these three original sins, there's also a lot of original virtue in how we set up our institutions that we have a lot to be thankful about. And Arvind Subramaniam said that a lot of India's economic growth has been because of the quality of institutions that we had. As centralized as they may be, as coercive in many ways as they may be, they also were, especially compared to other post-colonial states, were actually decently good institutions. So we are talking about, making things better rather than saying, look, everything that happened that time was bad, ugly, etc. So I think I want to start with that acknowledgement. Now, within that context, the problem with any kind of revolutionary change is that it happens too fast, that it goes in many different directions, that it's really difficult for us to control. So even if you look at the French Revolution, for example, right, obviously lots of people look up to it because of its espousal of those values, but it also went in fairly violent and chaotic directions. So to that extent, I think revolutionary change, when it happens, can lead to a lot of social chaos and unrest, which can be difficult to control. And therefore, I certainly belong to that group which says that, look, we need to keep making small and medium-sized evolutionary changes to get to a better society. For example, I do have a lot of faith in our ability as a country to self-correct some of our political excesses. Yes, we will put new problems in place, but hopefully we'll also solve the old ones. At some point, the dismissal of state governments by the center became so rampant that the Supreme Court came and greatly restricted it. And we have seen the instances of the state governments being dismissed become far fewer than they were back in the day. In fact, it's almost unheard of now unless there's something really major. So I think those kind of evolutionary changes will keep happening. We will also then keep having new problems like the electoral bond system, which has come in for a lot of criticism for being a gateway for kind of black money and concentration of power. I would rather bet my horses on evolutionary change getting us to a better place rather than kind of an uncertain revolutionary change, which I'm not sure how we handle. So, for example, one revolutionary change today would be, let's rewrite the constitution. But I would be somewhat skeptical about the kind of constitution that we would be able to write at this moment.
I would be extremely skeptical given the guys who are going to rewrite it.
So I think that is why I lean more towards the latter piece. And again, I mean, at some level, it's coming from a sense of trust that I think a lot of Indians share within kind of our government, etc., that despite all its limitations, etc., sometimes we do, broadly get many of the things right. So that's why that puts me far more I'm more comfortable and understand evolutionary change a lot more rather than revolutionary change.
Yeah, and that's an optimistic view, and more power to you. So my penultimate question does include optimism, but does include pessimism as well. If we look forward to 2040, what is your best case scenario and your worst case scenario for India?
So in 2040, my best case scenario for India is that our citizenry has moved beyond the roti kapda makan issue and have had care so much about the higher order questions of life around agency and liberty that we create the foundation for a far more prosperous country. I don't think by 2040 we are making such drastic transitions, just about some 17, 18 years away. But hopefully, as we become a richer country, we start thinking more about things beyond the bare essentials and about what makes us better citizens, what makes our lives more meaningful and more interesting and more autonomous. And that's my best case scenario for India, because I think unless that foundation is put in place, unless we create a culture where people care about liberty, I don't think we are building the superstructure that all of us are hopeful. So we can argue what's the best constitution to have, but unless people believe in that, we're not going to have that. The worst case scenario for India, which I think is true for a whole bunch of countries globally as well, is that we enter this new age of what one might call surveillance crony capitalism, to modify a popular phrase, which is, it's not even true capitalism because we are not really free to participate in the market, but it's crony capitalism that's dominated by a few players, be it global big tech, Indian big business, whatever else. And that is explicitly promoted by a state in a way that is very disempowering for the citizen. That, as we were discussing earlier today, that the citizen almost loses any kind of consent, not just in their relationship with others, but with their relationship with themselves. And I think we are putting in place the tools to make that happen. As Yuval Harari says in his book, that, even COVID, for example, put us in the direction of far greater surveillance state. And I worry, and my worst case scenario therefore is that we keep going down that path in a way that keeps eroding at individual liberties. And now we actually have all the tools to make that happen.
Wow, optimistic words. So, final question, and standard one for my show for all my guests. For me and my listeners, recommend books, music, films, art, anything that you really love and that you're so excited about, you just want to share with everyone.
So, the process of writing this book took me to a lot of other books which I think more people need to read about and write about. I would encourage people to read about more books around public institutions. For me, what was really useful was this anthology called that Pratap Bhanu Mehta and others had put out around public institutions, In Service of the Republic by Shah and Kelkar, Malevolent Republic by Kapil Komireddy. So reading about a lot of these, again, each of them has a different style of writing, but these really opened my eyes to looking at India very differently. And I would in particular encourage people to look at the other side of the aisle. So if you're leftward leaning, read A New Idea of India, understand why are people on the right excited about the shape and the direction that our country is taking. And in case you want, and I'm sure this is somewhat of a hackneyed answer, but in case you want to spook yourself about the state of the world, then perhaps Black Mirror is a good series to start with, because at least it'll wake you up from, or open your eyes to the possibilities that we can go down under.
Subhashish, man, it's been such a pleasure talking to you. So thank you so much for giving me so much of your time. This has been great.
Thank you so much, Amit, for having me and for doing what you do in terms of bringing all these interesting conversations to us.
If you enjoyed listening to this episode, check out the show notes, enter rabbit holes at will. You can follow Subhashish on Twitter at Subhashish30. It's linked from the show notes. You can follow me on Twitter at Amit Varma, AMITVARMA. You can browse past episodes of The Seen and the Unseen at seenunseen.in. Thank you for listening. Did you enjoy this episode of The Seen and the Unseen? If so, would you like to support the production of the show? You can go over to seenunseen.in/support and contribute any amount you like to keep this podcast alive and kicking. Thank you.